What is the biological basis of intelligence? At the HBI, we're tackling science's most difficult and ambitious project to understand the nature of complex intelligence. Understanding intelligence necessitates interdisciplinary research. Brain, cognition, artificial intelligence. The HBI houses world experts in cognition, brain, AI, as well as state-of-the-art research infrastructure under one roof, affording interdisciplinary research synergy in real-time interactions. At the HBI, we have Non-Human Primate Research Center, Brain Imaging Center, the HBI Child Cognition Center, the HBI Social Interaction Lab, the HBI Center for Brain-Inspired Computing Research. All these supporting international, interdisciplinary, and collaborative working environment. The HBI is unique in bringing 3 lines of research: brain, cognition, and artificial intelligence under one roof. This visionary strategy places the HBI as a world-class research institute. Join us in our quest to understand the nature of intelligence. What is the biological basis of intelligence? At the HBI, we're tackling science's most difficult and ambitious project to understand the nature of complex intelligence. Understanding intelligence necessitates interdisciplinary research. Brain, cognition, artificial intelligence. The HBI houses world experts in cognition, brain, AI, as well as state-of-the-art research infrastructure under one roof, affording interdisciplinary research synergy in real-time interactions. At the HBI, we have Non-Human Primate Research Center, Brain Imaging Center, the HBI Child Cognition Center, the HBI Social Interaction Lab, the HBI Center for Brain-Inspired Computing Research. All these supporting international, interdisciplinary, and collaborative working environment. The HBI is unique in bringing 3 lines of research: brain, cognition, and artificial intelligence under one roof. This visionary strategy places the HBI as a world-class research institute. Join us in our quest to understand the nature of intelligence.
Good morning, everyone. So we are delighted to have this forum for neurocomputation. So this morning we will have 5 leading scientists in computation neuroscience, and we will focus on the computational mechanism of cognition and neural circuit. So in the beginning, I will give you a very brief introduction to the topic of our forum. So due to the vast amount of data currently generated in neuroscience and the understanding of the principle of brain computation is very important. So this forum will focus on modeling neural data to explain the computational principles of brain and quantitative research on the various system based on mathematical models, focusing on the brain sensory processing principles, working memory, decision-making, and other key computational process. So first, I will introduce our first speaker, Professor Guangyu Yang. He's from MIT, and Robert Yang is interested in building neural networks and circuits model of brain function. He has contributed to the modern use of recurrent neural networks as a modeling tool in neuroscience. His work has shed light on neural mechanism for cognitive flexibility, and the Yang Lab focused on building multi-scale, multi-system integrated models of higher cognitive function. And his lecture title is Meta-Learning Synaptic Plasticity for Novelty Detection and Long-Term Memory. So welcome, Robert Yang.
Hi, can you see me?
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you, Song Laoshi, for the invitation and for the introduction. So I actually was trying to find the 直播间 on B 站 and couldn't find it, but I hope people are able to see this. So I changed my title a little bit to be simpler. So now I'm just going to talk about plastic neural networks and how to find them. Yeah, okay. So hopefully everybody has already heard of artificial neural networks, and besides being really useful, like as general tools for AI, they're also useful to help us understand brains and minds. So one main use is data analysis tools, but for many computational neuroscientists like us, they can also be very helpful to model complex behavior and model complex activity patterns in the brain, and it also allow us to study the brain from an optimization perspective, helping us understand why the brain is doing what it's doing. So a lot of my past work is focused on general purpose recurrent neural networks and using them to study cognitive neuroscience. And so this line of research really date back many decades. But in the past 10 years, it has been kind of revisited by people like David Susilo and others. And the general framework goes like this. So you take, for example, a cognitive task that people are interested in, for example, a certain decision-making task, and then you take a single recurrent neural network. So this is a network where the neurons are all connected to one another, and then you can change how the neurons are connected to one another using a learning rule, for example. Typically, it's a gradient descent-based learning rule. And after that, you can train the network to do the task, and then you can analyze the network the same way that you would analyze neural data recorded from the brain, for example, from prefrontal cortex in the brain. And so you can analyze a recurrent network and then compare it with the data. Now, this has been quite useful, but it actually has lots of problems. So some of these problems are inherent to the use of deep learning methods. For example, that you cannot write down mathematically the solution that you find so easily. It's hard to interpret the network after training. But there are also some very specific issues of using this recurrent neural networks for cognitive neuroscience. So one of them is cognition clearly involves a wide range of cortical brain areas, cortical areas, and increasingly people know that subcortical areas are also used, like thalamus and so on. And so cognition is also very flexible, right? So that's really one of the cool things about it. But a recurrent neural network trained on a single task is not really flexible, right? That's all it does is a single task. And so learning of many lab tasks rely on existing circuitry, right? So when a human goes into a lab, you're not starting from a random place, right? You're not starting from a random network, but many of these recurrent neural networks are being trained from like randomly connected networks, which is clearly not realistic. So So these are specific issues to using recurrent neural networks for cognitive neuroscience. So my opinion, and I believe many others share this, is we have to move beyond the classical paradigm. And if we describe the first generation of these neural networks as single task, single RNN, and using backpropagation for training, hopefully in the future we would move to networks with more naturalistic cognition, networks that have multiple areas and cell types and so on. And finally, we can use more biological learning rules, especially plasticity rules, for supporting learning, rather than necessarily backpropagation. So over the years, I have, together with many colleagues and collaborators, contributed a little bit to these directions. I'm not going to just give you a taste of it. So we have worked on how to build networks for multiple tasks, multiple cognitive tasks. Worked on kind of giving neural networks different cell types or multiple systems, not just a single area. But today what I will talk about is how we can give networks plasticity, for example, short-term plasticity, and then long-term plasticity for long-term episodic memory, but also long-term familiarity detection. So today, hopefully, I'll talk about two stories, and if we have time, I might give you a taste of a third story as well. So I'll start by introducing the kind of questions that I think will really benefit by having plasticity in neural networks. Now, for people who are doing computation neuroscience before 2010, using plasticity is a very, very natural thing. For example, one of the organizer of this forum, Songsen Laoshi, is very, very famous for studying STDP, short spike timing dependent plasticity, and since about 2012, at least a lot of people are influenced by machine learning, where really the main way that learning happens is through gradient descent, right? So we're trying to bring plasticity back, and we're trying to show why plasticity is important. So let's first look at three types of memory and see. So this works a lot better if we're in person and can see you guys, but now I just see myself on the screen. But still, hopefully there are people on the other end who would recognize this picture. Okay, so some of you might have seen this picture, right? This is from《武林外传》. It's one of my favorite TV show. And so when you're able to tell whether or not you have seen this, you're using your long-term familiarity, or people call it recognition memory. So you can recognize that you have seen this before. But there are different types of memory. For example, I can ask you, what are they saying in the scene, right? So you see this picture, but you don't know what they say. Now, some of you might remember what they're saying. Now, what you're using is episodic memory, right? You're kind of recalling the whole episode or part of the episode. You're recalling details given some part of the information, right? You can recall more information. Now, I can also ask you, what was my first question, right? Then ask you. And I believe many of you will remember that my first question is, have you seen this scene before? Do you recognize this? So this is short-term memory, right? It's if I ask you what is the first word I said in this whole talk, you probably don't remember, right? So that memory has faded away already, because this short-term memory is usually lasts about a second or 2 seconds, or like up to like a couple minutes. So people used to think that all these memories have the same mechanisms, but of course now we know that they have different mechanisms. You can have, for example, no new long-term memory, but still a lot of short-term memory. But what is not clear is the neural mechanisms behind all of these different memories. So today, this is what we want to look at, and hopefully I can show you how modern machine learning techniques can allow us to probe these questions, to ask the mechanisms behind these memories in new and exciting ways. Okay, so let's first focus on short-term memory. So short-term memory or particular form of short-term memory, working memory, is perhaps one of the most studied topics in cognitive neuroscience over like many decades. And so there are many hypotheses on the neuromechanisms. And the typical experimental paradigm to study these short-term memory goes like this. So hopefully you can see my mouse. So usually you see a stimulus, something, right, during, let's say, a sample period that can last maybe 500 milliseconds. And then there's a delay period when you're supposed to still remember the stimulus. And then there's a test period when you're tested about what you saw. For example, I can ask you to report what you saw. So you can say, okay, I saw like a bunch of dots moving to the upper right direction. But I can also ask you a different question. I can ask you, is this stimulus that I'm showing you during the test period the same as a stimulus during the sample period, right? I can ask you other things as well. But the important thing is there's a delay period that is maybe 1 second, 2 seconds, when you have to remember the stimulus. So people have different hypotheses about how this works, right? So a lot of ideas is centered around using neural activity to store information. So this is a cartoon of the neural activity in the so-called state space. So you can think of it as this is like a low-dimensional representation of the neural activity, high-dimensional neural activity during the delay period. And the activity can be, for example, sustained, or maybe it's going through some specific dynamic trajectory that is different for different stimuli, or it can be maybe a transient, which is a bit like a dynamic, but it's going back to the origin. But many people have been interested in an alternative or a complementary hypothesis, which is where the memory doesn't have to be stored in activity. It can be stored in synaptic weight, for example. So the basic idea goes like this. So if you have a bunch of neurons that have short-term plasticity in their synapses, then during the sample period, the sample stimulus would activate a group of neurons, right? Here indicated by these like black neurons. And what's going to happen is the connection weights coming out of these neurons, right, would, for example, be strengthened, right? Let's say that the connection weights are strengthened, they become stronger. Now, during the test period, if I want to recall what I stored during the sample period, all we need to do is to give a probe input that just uniformly activate all the neurons. But because some of the connection weights have been strengthened, the neurons, even though they get uniform input, some neurons would be activated more than others. And these neurons that would be activated more than others overlap a lot with a sample period neurons. So you're able to kind of recall a version of what you stored in the past. So this is kind of the intuition behind the synaptic model of short-term memory. The tricky thing is it's really, really hard to know whether or not the brain is using that, right? Because it's really hard to record the synaptic weight, especially the short-term plastic synaptic weight when animals be performing a task. So what we're trying to do is to use machines to ask this following question: when should a network use activity, and when should a network use synaptic plasticity for short-term memory? So, by the way, all the work I'm going to talk about today is really done by other people. And so I'm very happy and privileged to be here to advertise their work. Specifically, this work is mainly done by Nick Mas when he was a postdoc in Dave Friedman's group at UChicago. So we started with a hypothesis that working memory is more active when it needs to be manipulated. And I'll explain what that means. But to test this hypothesis, what we need is a neural network that has some short-term plasticity, so it can possibly use short-term plasticity to do the task. So we have this recurrent neural networks where the neurons here they're given short-term plasticity in their connection weights. And without going into too much details, I'll show you one example synapse that has short-term potentiation. So it's the facilitating synapse. So let's say the presynaptic neuron of this synapse has some strong activity at time 0. So what happens is there are two variables that change. So one is the available neurotransmitter would go down because this presynaptic neuron has just fired. But at the same time that you can imagine the calcium level goes up in the synapse, and then the neurotransmitter utilization goes up. And the final synaptic efficacy is the product of these two terms. So essentially this term is U times X. And in the end, the actual synaptic weight is the synaptic efficacy times a fixed synaptic weight. Now that fixed synaptic weight is being trained using machine learning, using backpropagation. But when the network is doing the task, it's not only using its fixed synaptic weights, it can also rely on this dynamic synaptic weight, right, determined by this synaptic efficacy. So what we try to do is to train this network on different working memory tasks, like the ones I described before. But importantly, we chose tasks that may require different level of manipulation. So here's what I mean. So the first task is what I have already described. It's the delay match to sample task. You have to say whether or not the test stimulus is the same as a sample stimulus. Now, intuitively, all you need to do is to remember the sample stimulus and then say whether or not they're the same, right? So it doesn't seem like you need to manipulate the sample stimulus, the stimulus you stored in memory. However, we can also train the network to do a different task, delay match to rotated sample task. Now here, you have to say you're not saying whether or not the sample is the same as a test. You're saying whether or not if you rotate the sample by 90 degrees clockwise, whether or not that rotated sample is the same as a test. For example, in this case, this would be a match because you can rotate the sample by 90 degrees and it's the same as a test. So you can imagine in this case, intuitively, you need more manipulation of the input than this task below. And what we try to see is whether or not in the task that requires more manipulation, in this delay match to rotated sample, the network relies more on activity than it does in the delay match to sample task. So to do that, what we will do is to try to decode the whether or not the stimulus is stored in the neurons or stored in the synaptic efficacy during the delay period. So we'll try to decode the identity of the sample stimulus during the delay period from these different variables. And here, each curve is one network that is separately trained. So what you can see is in this network, for networks trained on delay match to sample, there are networks where during the delay period, you cannot decode at all from the neurons. There's no information in the neurons about the identity of the sample stimulus. However, in a network trained on the delay match to rotated sample, across all the networks, you can somehow decode the identity of the sample stimulus during the delay period from the neurons. So this is saying that in networks trained on delay match to rotated sample, a task that requires more manipulation, the network is also using more persistent activity during the delay period. Right? So we can quantify this whole relationship across many different tasks that we have trained. So this quantification relies on kind of a particular way where we quantify the level of manipulation, which is a bit complicated, so I'm not going into the details here. You're welcome to check out this paper that has been published for a while now. But what we see is a very strong correlation between the level of manipulation that is presented in this task and in this network trained on this task and the level of persistent neuronal activity. So to summarize, what we have shown here is if you allow a recurrent neural network to use plasticity, it would actually prefer to solve many tasks using plasticity rather than using neural activity. So there's very interesting reasons here that I can go in more if people have questions. But if the network requires manipulation of information, then it actually prefers to use more activity. So it's really not that there are two separate mechanisms that sometimes you use one, sometimes you use the other. It's more like you're always kind of using both, but sometimes you use one more than the other, depending on whether or not you need to manipulate. So this is the first story that I wanted to share with you. Now let's move on to a second kind of memory, which is long-term familiarity or recognition memory. So as I showed you before, humans, we can have very remarkable recognition memory. For example, many of you probably saw 委员外传 like 15 years ago, and you might still recognize that scene, right, after so many years. So in the lab, we can test this kind of long-term recognition memory using the following paradigm. So you're shown a sequence of images, for example, like this flower and the sunset, and then sunset again. And every time an image is shown, you have to the subject has to report whether or not the stimulus is novel or it's familiar. For example, this image, when it's first shown, is novel, and this is novel, but then this one is familiar because you have seen it, and importantly, you saw it one time step ago. So this, you can call it a one back task, and then this one is novel again, and this one is familiar. Now this is 4 back because the last time you saw it was 4 images ago. And it turns out humans are very, very good at this. For example, I can show you a stimulus and then show you a thousand images, then show you that image again, and then you would still be able to recognize that image with 80% accuracy, right? Which is pretty remarkable. So, and monkeys can do this as well, although not with as good a capacity as humans. Now, how do we do that? So to do that, again, we will train some neural networks and give them some plasticity. And in particular, we would train them on a very, very similar task. Here, essentially, the stimulus of the network, just 1 second, sorry. The network is given a sequence of stimuli. So in fact, we give them just a vector made of +1 and -1s. And then they have to report whether or not it's familiar or it's novel. And importantly, the R is how many steps back that a familiar stimulus was first shown. Okay, so for example, here the R would be 5. Now, let's first train a recurrent network to do this task, because why not, right? So what we will do is we will train, for example, a network on a data set where R is always 3. So whenever there is a familiar stimulus, it was always a 3-back familiar stimulus, right? Now, the recurrent network can do this task very, very well, right? The training accuracy is perfect. But then you can test it on different levels of R, right? Importantly, you can test it on even simpler tasks, right? Where R is 1 or 2, which should be easier than R equals to 3, right? But in fact, this network doesn't generalize at all, right? It's just fundamentally incapable of generalizing if it's trained on a very narrow range of R, okay? So you can even train it on a larger range, and it still doesn't generalize that well outside of the training distribution. So this is a really strong failure from the recurrent network on out-of-distribution generalization. Now, so neuroscientists have been studying this problem for many years. Now, in fact, these people, Bogesh and Brown, back 20 years ago, have already proposed that anti-Hebbian plasticity is a really good mechanism to support this kind of task. So how does it work? So essentially, you have the stimulus represented by a group of neurons, and they would feed into this single neuron, the single output neuron, and the connections are governed by anti-Hebbian plasticity, which is the opposite of Hebbian plasticity, which means if two neurons are firing together, then the connection between them would grow weaker rather than stronger. Right? Hebbian plasticity, they would grow stronger, but this is the opposite. So imagine that you have this input and it's novel, and then it would drive the output neuron. So the output neuron would be active. Then according to the anti-Hebbian plasticity, the connection between this neuron and the output neuron would get weaker. And this neuron and the output neuron would get weaker, right? So next time you show the same stimulus again, now it's a familiar stimulus, then because these connections have been weakened, then the output neuron would not fire as much, right? So essentially, by looking at whether or not the output neuron can fire, we can tell whether or not the stimulus is novel or familiar. Now, this sounds like a pretty good idea, right? So what's there to do? So it turns out that if you try to run this algorithm continually, it doesn't really work. So by continually, I mean, for example, this familiarity detection task, right? We're doing it all the time in our life. At any given moment, we're able to tell whether or not something is familiar or not, right? So it's not like we're pre-storing some stimuli, we experience something, and then we're being tested on it, right? We have to just be able to do this task at any moment in our time. And this original algorithm doesn't work for this continual familiarity detection. So to have a network that can do that, we train a neural network that has plasticity. And now importantly, so it has two types of connections from the input neuron to a hidden layer. One kind of connections is plastic, where we will try to learn the specific plasticity rule. And another connection is fixed. And I'll explain why we need to have this second kind of connection, and why this second kind of connection will determine the address of the plasticity. So just to show you some equations, so the input x is multiplied by the sum of W1 and AT, and then eventually that gives us the hidden layer activity, and then it goes through another connection. Now we have the Y, which is a final readout. And this A matrix, which is a plastic matrix, is governed by some simple plasticity rules. So here, lambda times A tells you how much the A will decay over time. For example, if lambda is 0, then you would forget all the plastic information that you had in the past. If lambda is 1, then you would try to keep a lot. Now, eta, it determines whether or not it's Hebbian or anti-Hebbian, right? So if eta is 1, then it would be Hebbian plasticity. If eta is positive, then it would be Hebbian plasticity. If eta is negative, then it would be anti-Hebbian plasticity. Right. So here X is pre-synaptic activity, and H is postsynaptic activity. So this is a very simple learning rule. And what we will do is use machine learning to train the network on this continual familiarity detection task, where the gradient descent rule would learn lambda and eta, which are the parameters of the plasticity rule, and also W1. Okay, so this is what happens after we train the network. So here you have the RNN curve, which is still, again, quite terrible. But if you train this network, again, on R train equals to 5 and test it on different Rs, you see these networks generalize very naturally to different levels of R, right? Suggesting that this plastic network is fundamentally better than a recurrent network, right? This is not like 3% improvement, right? This is really a fundamental improvement. And in particular, when we train the network, we can find two kinds of solutions. So sometimes eta is positive, giving you a Hebbian solution. Sometimes eta is negative, giving you an anti-Hebbian solution. And it turns out the anti-Hebbian solution is consistently much better than the Hebbian solution, even if these networks, they have the same number of neurons and everything. And the only thing that differs is the solution that they end up learning. So I like to show this plot just to show how robust all of this is. So here I'm showing you lambda and eta during meta-learning for different networks where the plasticity rules are initialized with different values. In particular, here we're color coding each network according to the initial eta level. As you can see that if you initialize the eta to be positive, they tend to end up being positive. And if you initialize them to be negative, they tend to end up being negative. But they very robustly end up at the exact same value for the same R, which I find quite remarkable. So we have shown that meta-learning can recover anti-Hebbian plasticity. But of course, we already know that anti-Hebbian plasticity is good from Bogans and Braun at least 20 years ago. So what's new here, right? It turns out this addressing term, this W1 term that we found is very important for performance of the task. So if we didn't have W1, then we're actually unable to train the network to do this continual familiarity detection task. Now, what does W1 do after training? It turns out it has a very specific form. The W1 learned is strong, it's sparse, and it's, of course, by design, a fixed feed-forward connections. And so what it does, it turns out, so we did a lot of analysis trying to understand what this W1 is doing. So what I'm telling you is kind of the outcome of all of that. It is W1 will select a particular set of neurons. For each stimulus, it would select a small set of neurons to be active in the hidden layer. And these neurons, when we show the stimulus again, so for example, here, when we show a novel stimulus, that you see these 3 neurons are active, and then we can show this stimulus again, perhaps at this time point, and these neurons would all be silent. Now, that these neurons would be silent, that's because of the anti-Hebbian plasticity. But these neurons are active in the first place because of W1. So here, what you can see is W1 and A work together to solve the continual familiarity detection task. What W1 does is to select the neurons that are active in the first place. So they select the address of the memory. That determines where the memory will be stored, right? And then the A matrix, the plasticity rule, determines how the memory will be stored. So they store the memory by decreasing the weights, the synaptic weights, by depressing the synapse. And so these neurons wouldn't be active again when the stimulus is familiar. So I know this is kind of brief and maybe it's not super clear. So I welcome you to read our paper. But so we think, so the main takeaway here is we can use meta-learning to find plasticity rules that that might be hard to find by hand. Now, in this case, we have anti-Hebbian plasticity rule that people have already discovered, but you can use this method to discover other plasticity rules that people haven't designed yet. But at the same time, it's not just about the plasticity rule, right? People have focused a lot on the plasticity rule, but we can also think about addressing where the plasticity is happening. This is not necessarily determined by just the pre and postsynaptic weights. So in fact, just very briefly, I won't have time to go into details, but if we want to do episodic memory, so we have proposed that in a new kind of network architecture for episodic memory that some people call modern Hopfield networks, that we like to call key-value memory networks, we can use, we proposed a new kind of plasticity rule that would support memory formation in this kind of key-value memory networks. And in particular, this new plasticity rule have a very explicit separation of how the plasticity happens and where the plasticity happens. So for people who know a lot about like a single neuron physiology, so where the plasticity happens is being determined by a third factor, and in particular, the dendritic plateau potential, whereas how the plasticity happens is more traditional. So anyway, I won't have time. I'm not explaining it all, but if you're interested, you can check out this paper we published last year. So with that, I'll stop, and I'll thank our collaborators. So we have recently, last year, we have opened our group at MIT. And if you're interested in working with us, please contact me. And the work I described today is really done by Dan Chumankov. The second part with the help of Ching and Aparna and Larry. And then the first part is really done by Nick with the help of Dave Friedman and Francis and Xiaojing. With that, I'll conclude. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thanks, Guangyu, for your wonderful talk. So I think we will have some time to take several questions from the audience. So maybe I start from the first question. So you talk about these connection matrix. So in the recurrent network, normally people do not assume the non-activity of the connection matrix, right? So if we consider about biological plausibility, so what do you comment on this extension to adding this non-activity constraint on this matrix A and W1?
I see. Thank you for the question. So just a technical detail. Here we're not setting W1 and A to be to obey Dale's law. In the previous work that I described, that by Nick Musk, we actually do have EI separation, excitatory and inhibitory connections. And actually, in our first work that we did together with Francis Song back in 2016, the first recurrent networks we trained are excitatory and inhibitory. So it's so of course Dale's law is one of the most known feature of the brain, and I find it really fascinating that it's such a robust thing that has been evolutionarily conserved, and yet we still don't really know why it happens. So I think in practice, it's straightforward enough to implement this kind of constraint. We can just set the connections to be excitatory and inhibitory. What is much harder, and I think far more interesting, is to figure out why this is such a good thing. So people have some proposals. So you can look up balanced amplification, or there's people who propose that EI network can be fast sampling. But I don't think there's anything that is very, very kind of accepted or very, very convincing yet. So it's a very interesting question. We don't know why. It's easy to implement, but we don't know why we should use them yet.
Thank you, Guangyu. So maybe
I have a question actually. Yeah, I'm finally back.
Yeah, please.
Guangyu, I have a question. For the last part, have you envisioned combining this key address together with the recurrent networks? Because in hippocampus, that seems to be like the two stages, right? I was wondering, what do you think about that? Thanks.
Yeah, definitely. So in this work with Dan and Larry, we specifically didn't have recurrent connection because we thought that it would complicate the mathematics and it would make it harder to understand it. But of course, like you said, that everywhere there's recurrent connection, right? So to think about how, for example, the recurrent connection might play a role in all of this, right? So it's possible that the recurrent connection would determine the address, and then the plasticity would store the memory. So I think that's very interesting. So that would be a very interesting direction to look into, to just how recurrent connection may play a role in determining the memory address.
Yeah, thanks. So actually, we're kind of working on these questions, so we can talk next. Yeah.
That's exciting. Yeah.
Okay, so we have another question from Liu Jin. And so his question is, how to classify excitatory and inhibitory neuron in a standard recurrent neural network?
Sorry, I didn't fully understand how to
classify excitatory and inhibitory neurons in a standard recurrent neural network.
If you train a recurrent networks that doesn't have excitatory and inhibitory neurons to begin with, it usually doesn't separate into excitatory neurons and inhibitory neurons, right? So an excitatory neuron is one that only sends excitatory connections. Now, if you train a network to do anything, usually any neuron would send both excitatory and inhibitory connections. So you won't be able to see that. And it would be actually quite nice if you can train a network and then it grows E and I, right? Then you're finding a way to say, oh, EI is really good, right? It's like this network, if you train it to do this thing, it becomes ENI. But we have never observed that, and I don't think anyone has reported that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. So due to the time constraint, I think we have to stop here. And let's thank Guangyu again for his wonderful talk. I think I would like to hand over the forum to Professor Song Sen. So please.
Oh, hi. Yeah, thanks. Sorry, I had some problems with my laptop. Yeah, actually, next we'll have Professor Su Wu. Actually, Su Wu was the professor who convinced me to return to China. So he's definitely more senior than me. So I'm really glad to introduce Professor Su Wu. Among other things, Professor Su Wu did his graduate studies in general relativity, but he thought that general relativity was too easy, so he switched to neuroscience. And then for postdoc, he worked with, among others, Professor Amari at the Recurrent in Japan, who, as some of you might know, actually discovered the backprop rule earlier than these Turing Prize winners. For all purposes, Professor Su is really a pioneer. And I'm really glad this time he will bring us a unified theory of many things, which I think will be very important, probably one of the first in the world. Let's have Professor Su. Thanks.
Oh, okay. Can everyone listen to me and see my PPT clearly? 大家看得见我的看得清楚吗？
我能看见，可以，谢谢。
Okay. So I apologize. I will give my talk in Chinese because I know most audience are Chinese, and also the topics is more very multidisciplinary. So there are many spatialology, mathematical terminology. So I think it's better for me to introduce my work in Chinese, but my slides in English. 很高兴啊，我有这个机会来给大家介绍一下，就是我们 过去一些年做的一些工作，是关于一个我叫它 Unified Model， 因为这个 model 呢可以解释很多现象，比如说 Traveling Wave、Phase Shift 和 Anticipatory Tracking。OK， 首先呢，我开始呢就介绍，就是说，这个 Unified Model， 我首先介绍的 model， 到时候我来 justify 它为什么是一个 Unified Model。OK， 那么首先呢，这个 model 呢是一个 Attractor Network Model。那么我们为什么考虑 attractor 呢？所以说我们简单说，就是我们大脑的话，我们知道我们大脑特别复杂，现在我们大脑怎么做计算，很多东西都不清楚。但是有一个 fundamental 的一点，就是大脑是用网络来计算，是吧？我们大脑有10的11次方的神经元，每个神经元都有 on average 都是 1000 to 那个 10,000 的那 connection， 它们构造特别复杂的网络。虽然有实验 argue 说 single neuron 能干一些很 interesting things，但是总的说来，我们大脑还是用网络来做计算。每个 computation unit 是相对简单的，是网络来实现的特别复杂的计算。那么这就引申了，就是说所谓的连接主义，也就是目前的深度学习网络的那种雏形 idea 的来源，就是说我们大脑是用网络来做计算。如果我们大脑用网络做计算的话，那么这就面临一个问题，它怎么做计算，是吧？那么基本的思想就是神经元接受到外界的输入，然后神经元相互作用，然后网络的状态就 update。那么是个网络的状态，它来那个 convey, manipulate and store information。那么如果我们要想这个 information to repeatedly and reliably retrieval 或 manipulate 的话，那么很显然一点就是说，这个我们要用来表征信息的网络状态，它必须是可重复稳定的，所以说这就导致了我们说我们要考虑呢，这个信息呢是表征在网络的 stationary state 或者叫做 attractor 上。所以说从这个思想出发那么很多做计算神经科学的就发展了大量，在过去几十年发展了大量的那种模型或基于这种 attractor network 来解释很多大脑的功能。OK， 那么最经典的那个 attractor model 呢是 Hoffier model。那么 Hoffier 是个物理学家，他就把这个网络计算的这个极简化，他就考虑神经元就只有两个状态 firing 或 not firing， 那么就相当于它的 SI 呢等于正负1，然后神经元有个对称的连接，它忽略掉神经系统的非对称连接，就假设神经元有对称的连接，然后神经元的 integrand firing process 呢被它简化成一个神经元接收到别的神经元提供的输入，如果这个输入之和大于一个阈值，然后它就符号就发生变为正号，否则变为负号，就说把整个动力学呢，神经网络的计算动力学完全极简化。那么这样极简化有一个优点就是说，那么这样一个动力系统呢，它实际上就有一个能量函数。简单说，如果这个系统你接受了个输入的话，它就会演化，能量函数就总会向能量最小的状态趋近。那么这样能量最小的极小值呢，就对应着这个动力学系统的一个吸引子 attractor。所以左边这个是个示意图，就是我们一个系统中有很多 attractor， 如果你的系统的初始状态落入这个 attractor 吸引域的话，那么它就会持续到这个 local minimum。那么霍菲尔说 OK， 这样一个模型可以解释 associative memory， 我们可以把这个 attractor 定义成一个 memory。那么当我收到一些 noise 的 input 的话，我系统就会converge 到这个 attractor， 就相当于 noise 给平均掉了，那么我就把这个信息 retrieve 了。那么右边是个简单的例子，你可能最初刚开始给你的图像是一个有很多 noise 背景的蜘蛛那么这个蜘蛛呢这个输入演化以后呢，这个系统就逐步把 noise clean 出来，最后得到一个干净的一个蜘蛛然后你这个 memory 就 retrieve 了，你就很清楚的识别了这个这样一个这个物体这个图像，是吧？那么 Hoffier 的 model 呢它当然早期很有影响力虽然它有生物学不合理，但它现在在那个特别在 engineering 的中间仍然有很多应用。那么但是看 Hoffier 的 model 呢，简单说就是它相当于在能量函数空间，我们假想一个能量函数，那么它有很多 local minimum， 那个每个 local minimum 呢就代表了一个 memory。那么 Hoffier 的 model 呢，它就是考虑的是 random pattern 随机的那个 pattern。那么这些 pattern 之间的关系它有没有考虑？所以但是我们知道，我们大脑我们在储存记忆的时候，储存信息的时候，这些信息是要有相互之间有关系的，是吧？它们之间的相互关系也要被我们大脑表征出来，这样我们才能有效的表达信息或作为 memory searching 之类的。所以如果我们认为我们大脑从网络做计算，我们有一个 attractor space 来表征信息的话，我们可能就不满足于说 这样一些 attractor 呢，在空间中全是独立的。我们希望这些 attractor 之间有一些联系它们也许这个距离这个距离也许是一个数学上的距离。那么这个距离呢，能反映物体之间的 similarity 或相似性。OK， 那么以这个霍菲尔 model 对应的呢，就另一个极端，就是我们假设我们考虑一个极端的情况，我们叫做 continuous attractor。那么这个 continuous attractor 呢，就是我的能量函数呢，不像霍菲尔 model 是一个 local minimum， 我的能量函数呢有一个相对是一个子空间，这是个一维的 continuous attractor 呢，就是一维的一个峡谷。那么在这个峡谷中呢，每一个点都代表着表征了一个刺激的值。那么你看在这个峡谷是平的，是吧？所以它在峡谷上面呢，它就很容易的来回移动那么如果是一个连续变量的话，就特别好表征，比如0到2派，那么我0到2派这些刺激值呢，就沿着这个峡谷中呢就排开，然后呢沿着别的方向呢，我都是 attractor 一样，我有 attraction 把 noise 平均掉。但是我沿着这个峡谷走呢，我就很平滑的就移动，这样我的状态就能很 smooth 的update。那么这是一个也像是另一个极端的情况，叫 continuous attractor， 是我今天要报告主要谈到的一个网络模型。OK， 那么这个 attractor network 呢，在最早就 Amari 在1977年就提出来了，有很多不同的版本。那么这里我用的版本呢，是我们自己经常用的，我们自己写了个版本。这个版本的优点就是说它有个解析的理论解但是有构造一个 continuous attractor， 大家不管细节的话你也可以这样来理解。那么这个 continuous attractor 首先它要神经元之间有彼此相互的兴奋性作用。OK， 兴奋作用的优点就是说，如果我兴奋了，我就会把旁边的相邻的神经元也给兴奋，那么相邻神经元兴奋了，反过来又兴奋我，这样就有一个 self positive 的loop。这样的话，我就不依赖于外界的刺激，就外界刺激撤走以后，我还能 hold 住我的active state， 所以这是 stationary state， 是 active 的 stationary state。但是另一方面呢，光有这个还不够，如果我没有抑制性神经元来平衡的话，那么我这个网络呢就会相互作用，你越来越兴奋，最后有爆炸，是吧？所以说在这个网络中呢，我还需要一些抑制性神经元来平衡掉这个兴奋性。那么在这个模型中呢，我们是考虑一个 divisionalization， 就这个神经元到它输入之间有个分母，这个分母就表示如果我的这个神经元的活动太强烈的话，那么我就不再增加了，是吧？我会 saturate那么这是两点，这个就能保证我网络呢 hold 这个 localized active state 作为我的 attractor。那么 continuous attractor 特殊的地方在什么地方呢？是神经元之间的连接呢，它是个平移不变，就是说两个神经元之间的连接呢是它们距离的函数，不是它们位置绝对值的函数。所以说比如说两个神经元在 x 和 xi 撇的位置，两个神经元它们连接的强度呢是一个高斯函数那么就是说这个连接的 pattern 呢是平移不变的。我在空间中比如说我考虑一个0到2派的一个连续变量的话，那么我在这个空间中任何一个位置神经元之间相互连接的 pattern 是一样的，就是它空间的平移不变性。那么你就可以想象有兴奋性或抑制性有个恰当的比例，我能 hold 住 attractor， 然后由于这个对称性就表示呢，我在一个位置有 attractor， 在别的位置也会有，是吧？因为整个是对称的。所以这样一个模型的话，就会导致呢我这个网络呢，特别是我们写这个模型呢，它就有一个 continuous family of stationary state， 它不是一个，而是一个连续的一组的稳定状态。那么这个稳定状态呢，就是这个模型正好是一个高斯函数。那么在它这个 continuous family 体现在这个高斯函数它的peak 值这个 z， 它的位置呢是一个随机free parameter， 就可以取任何值，所以它就不是一个 attractor， 而是一个 continuous family of attractor。这种 continuous family attractor 就构造了刚才我们直观理解的，它就构造了能量函数中的峡谷。OK， 由于这个能量函数在峡谷是平的，那么这个就可以很好做 smooth tracking。如果你有个外界的 input 来的话，我这个 bump 就是高斯形状的 bump 呢就可以很自由的移动那么所以说这个模型呢就被广泛用来解释spatial vacation或我们 head direction 的转动。OK， 那么顺便这儿说一句就是说很多模型呢是先有实验现象，然后才有数学模型。 但是 continuous tractor 不一样 ，continuous tractor 是早就有了数学模型，后来才有的那个实验的发现。最早的模型是 Amari 的1977年，就相当于现在有个接近45年，45年前，那么就提出了这样模型，但不是刚才我介绍的样子，但是基本的思想都已经有了，都移植到了40年以后才是那个在那个 Nature 上，在那个果蝇上，他发现果蝇的那个 head direction neuron 呢，真是就像我们平时我们经常这样画，我们这个 continuous tracker 这个图啊，是已经画了很多很多年了，其实心里一直坍塌不安了，现在终于明白，大脑还真是这样的，至少在 head direction system 是这样的。那么在那个果蝇的那个椭圆体的那个部位的话，它有很多 neuron 来表征我们头的朝向，因为我们头的朝向是非常重要的，是吧？这是我们的一种 unconscious 的，我们要 perceive 我们那个我们头的朝向，这样我们才有正确的方位感，空间方位感，才能做 navigation。那么大家就发现呢，在那个果蝇的那个椭圆体那个地方呢，有很多头朝向的神经元，他们的确是根据他们 periphery 的那个头的那个角度呢，就像我们做模型中画的一样，他们组成一个圆，然后当这个果蝇的头在摆动的时候呢，这个 neural population active 就像那个 bump 呢，也就跟着那个头的朝向呢在来回的摆动，就说就好像在那个能量函数的 valley 里面很自由的移动一样。OK， 那么这是关于头朝向的continuous tractor。那么在二维空间中的话，那么空间的位置的话是二维的变量，那么我们就可以构造一个二维的 continuous tractor 来解释 spatial navigation。那么还有一些实验发现，即便有一些不是那么直观的一些continuous feature， 比如说我们看一个物体的视角，那么他们就发现呢，如果让猴子训练从不同角度看一个物体，你经过训练以后呢，在 IT 区的话，那些神经元呢也组成一种就是这种高深 tuning curve， 就好像构成那个 continuous tractor 来表征这样一个连续的变量。那么也有 study 就发现呢，在那个非常抽象的一些 feature， 比如说在做一个运动判断的是 motion direction 有个 confidence level，OK， 你对这个判断有多 confidence， 那么大家就发现呢，实际上是在那个我们的 prefrontal cortex 那个 network 里面呢，实际上它 embedding 一个 low dimensional space， 一个一维的 low dimensional space， 那么来表征了一个confidence 的一个连续的变量。而且我们还发现了很 interesting， 就是说深度学习网络实际上它从某种意义上它也已经包含了这样一个信息。那么我们干了一件什么事情呢？我们就是说我们先用那个 image late 训练了一个深度学习网络那么深度学习网络这个训练完了以后呢，你就会发现呢，这个深度学习网络呢，由于大数据训练 somehow 它就生成了一个 good representation。 这 good representation 呢，已经抓住了物体在 semantic sense 上的 similarity， 而不光是 image， 就是 pixel level similarity。 那什么意思呢？比如说你给你给它这个网络呈现卡车和鸟然后你每一层你都生成个 neural representation 是吧？然后如果你在前几层算 neural 这个卡车和鸟那个 representation 之间 correlation 的话，刚开始卡车与卡车之间和鸟与卡车之间都差不多的，但呢到了高层，特别到就 read out 之前的前一层的话，你会发现呢，实际上卡车与卡车之间的那个neural representation 呢，那 similarity 已经非常高了，而卡车和鸟之间的那个 similarity 就很差了。所以说这个深度学习网络somehow它就没用它，但是它又通过大数据训练呢，它是做一个 classification pass， 但是为了做一个很超大量数据的 classification， somehow 这个系统呢会 force 那个网络呢学成一个 representation 呢，能抓住物体在 semantic sense 上的 similarity。OK， 那么有了这个 similarity 呢，我们就可以用hub learning 来把这些神经元之间的连接就给生成，用一个 unsupervised hub learning 来生成，但中间有些 trick， 这不 trick 不重要，总的说就是一种 unsupervised hub learning 生成 trick。那么我们就生成一个类似于Hopfield model 的一个 recurrent network。那么这个 recurrent network 我们就发现呢，实际上它已经隐含了 continuous tractor。比如说我们给这个图像再呈现一个卡车，这个卡车的 size 由大到小，那么你就会每一个卡车不同 size 呢，就生成个 representation。你发现这个 representation 呢，它在一个高维空间中，实际上它有一个一维的一个 submanifold 呢， 那么这些那个是一个能量呢函数是平的，处于低谷，就把这个 representation 串在一起了。那么我们也可以用个椅子用旋转不同角度，你就发现这个旋转的角度呢，连续在旋转的时候呢，它们也构成了一个一维的 continuous structure， 在 embedding 在一个 high dimension 的一个representation 之中。OK， 所以说一方面实验发现了广泛的那个 continuous structure 存在在大脑中这个 deep learning 也展现其就是说它已经包含了这些 continuous structure 所需要的一些性质。那么为什么这么广泛呢？我觉得是这个原因，就是说我们大脑在这个世界上那个生成的话，我们需要对物体进行做分类，是吧？我们这个分类的时候呢，我们会抓住物体之间，不管是 image level 或者 semantic level 的一个 similarity。OK， 那么大脑怎么表征这个 similarity 呢？那么 fMRI data 现在已经揭示，就是说大脑在揭示 similar object 的时候呢，它激发的 neural representation 呢也会 similar， 就会有更大的 overlap 和 correlation。就是说这个物体之间的 similarity 和 dissimilarity 是通过 neural representation 的 similarity 和 dissimilarity 表征的。那么我们知道，如果神经元的活动它是具有 similarity 的话，如果你用 herb learning 的话，就会把这些参与就是说表征 similar object 的那个神经元之间连接会就变强，而表征不同 similarity 之间的connection 就会减弱。那么总的说呢，这个时候呢，如果你有大量的这样样本的话，你就会训练出一个 continuous structure。所以从某种意义上的 Hopfield model 呢是一个极端，就是说这些 memory pattern 呢全是独立的，宇称的 Hopfield model。另一个极端呢，如果你有个 continuous family of 样本，就是说他们那个这个相似性就是逐步变化的，这样一个旋转的椅子或者车由大到小，是吧？那么你生成 representation 通过 herb learning 你形成 continuous structure， 可能在真实的大脑中的话，根据你的那个处理样本不一样的话，你可能会介入中间。总的说来说，我们大脑生成一个 representation space attractor space 的话，这些 attractor 之间呢，它们有些 correlation， 有些 overlap， 通过 connection strengths 来表征出来呢，就会反映出这个memory item 之间的一些relationship。OK， 所以为什么说我们虽然在好像是在 study 一个非常抽象的一个简单的数学模型，我觉得它背后隐藏的意义可能是很深刻的。OK， 我们为了数学化的方面呢，我们去研究 continuous structure， 但是我们研究的结果呢，可以推广一个真实系统，它可能不是 perfect 的一个平的能量函数能量空间那么我们也可以做一个较好的近似。那么我下面要讲的就是说 continuous structure 如果我们再加上一个 adaptation， 那么这个网络就会体现出更有趣的现象。adaptation 什么意思呢？就是我们在模头中呢加入一个新的一个负反馈，这个负反馈的这个 V 的强度呢，它本身是以神经元的活动成正比的。就什么意思呢？如果是个神经元受到外界 input 或别的 recurrent interaction， 如果它的活动变得很强以后呢，它就会生成一个负的电流来压制它的活动。那么我们在这里面考虑的是叫 spike frequency adaptation， 就是说，那么这是一个大脑中广泛发现的一个现象，神经元的一个自适应的一种反应。OK， 那么加上一个 adaptation 的话，这个动力学系统就会出现特别有意思的现象。第一个现象就是说，原来的时候 continuous structure 这个 bump 它是稳的，是吧？那么由于有一个adaptation 呢，这个网络这个 bump 呢就会自由的移走，它自动的，不是靠我外界 drive， 它就自发的活动。那么我们这个叫做一个 traveling wave。那么这个机制也很好理解，就是说如果这个神经系统刚开始它的 bump 稳定在这儿，那么它有负反馈，神经元活动越强，它的负反馈就越大，它就会 destabilize， 就是说让它失稳。那么失稳呢，有 recurrent interaction 呢，它就被拉到旁边去，到了旁边的位置呢，它又失稳，所以它就稳不住在一个地方，它就会 keep 那个 rotating moving。那么我们这个叫做它呢 traveling wave。OK， 那么有了 traveling wave， traveling wave 相当于就是说我这个 continuous structure 有个intrinsic mobility， 就它有一个顺便我说一句，这个 traveling wave 呢，当你网络参数给定了，它有一个固定的速度，我们叫它 intrinsic speed， 这个速度是可以计算出来的，就是说它有多大。那么这个 traveling wave 呢，实际上是反映出这个网络呢有一个内在的不稳定性，叫 intrinsic mobility， 是吧？它总是想自己移动。OK， 那么我们就设想，如果这个时候我假设有个外界的移动的输入在驱动它，那么这个外界的驱动相当于extrinsic mobility， 那么这个 extrinsic mobility 就会它的 intrinsic mobility 进行相互竞争， 那么这个网络就会展现一些非常 interesting 的现象。那么这个是我们加了外界的一个 moving 的 input。那么它可以显示这样的形式，它以一个v external 的速度呢，在做移动，那么加入了 SFA 做一个引入一个 intrinsic mobility。那么首先就是如果这个外界的 input 很弱的话，那你就可以想象那么这个网络就是自由的移动了，是吧？就 traveling wave， 因为你外界 input 强度太弱，我抓不住它，所以它就会自由的移动。那么如果我外界 input 很强，那么这个时候呢，我的外界的 input 你 bump 就逃不掉了，我的外界的 input 就会拉着你的网络的 bump 呢，就做一个就做 face lock 的那个 tracking， 所以你外界那个内在的 input 呢就会 track 住我这个外界的 input 呢一起走。那么如果我这个外界的 input 的强度呢是在那个中间一个 moderate value 的话，那么我还会有一个现象，就是一个 oscillator tracking， 就是说我这个 bump 呢会沿着你的外界的 input 呢来回震荡。OK， 因为我想逃跑，我有 intrinsic mobility， 但我逃不掉，因为我逃远了以后呢，你的外界 input 把我拉回来，所以说我就围着你来回的震荡。那么我下面就讲这三种现象呢，实际上都有生物学意义，也就对应着我的 title 里面的 traveling wave、smooth tracking 和那个oscillator tracking， 就对着 phase shift。OK， 那么首先就是刚才我说了，这个 traveling wave 呢，就是说它实际上相当于就是说我网络呢，我就可以自由的在我的状态空间里面高速的游走，是吧？那么这个 traveling wave 呢，在实验中大家也经常发现，大家做实验就会发现，如果一个 in vivo 或 in vitro 有个 network 的话，有时候会突然的话，这个网络会产生一个 activity， 然后它在网络里面传一会儿它就消失了那么这种有可能就是来自一种adaptation 导致的不稳，让那个 network 那个产生那个 traveling wave。那个 traveling wave 有什么样的意义呢？我们发现它也许可以解释这么一个现象。我们知道在这个现象呢，我首先介绍一个背景是叫 Levy flight。Levy flight 简单就是说比如说老鼠它在一个开放的环境中寻找食物的时候你记录它的轨迹，就会发现呢它的轨迹是有一个 long jump， 然后在一个 local 的位置呢就在那儿找一会儿一个布朗运动，一个局部的布朗运动，然后又一个 long jump， 然后又一个布朗运动。所以这个 Levy flight 简单定义就是说它是一个 mixture of 一个 long jump， 然后一个 local 的那个 search。 那么数学上已经证明了的话，如果你在一个开放的 unknown 的环境中去寻找一个 target 的话Levy flight 当它Levy flight 指数为1的时候呢，它就是 optimal 的 information search 的那个方法。所以你一个很自然的想法是，如果我们大脑储存了很多信息，我给了个外界的 Q， 我要来找那个我的那个信息的时候，那我也应该用数学上去优化 Levy flight， 是吧？在行为上好像也是这样的。比如说你看我们在打篮球的时候，你眼睛可能就来回的看运动员的运动，是吧？如果你把眼动的轨迹记录下来，你会发现它是个 Levy flight。然后呢，如果我们让我们大脑做自由的回想，就是像 free memory recall 的话，你会发现呢，也会体现着 Levy flight 的特征。那么这个假设我们前面讲了，我们考虑 attractor space 是有结构的 attractor space， 在数学上理想化的时候，这个 continuous attractor 的时候，这 continuous attractor 怎么产生一个 Levy flight 呢？那么我发现可以这样产生。首先刚才我 miss 掉了，就是说traveling wave state 的产生呢，需要我的那个 adaptation 的强度呢大到一定的阈值，超过一个 boundary， 然后我的那个才会产生 traveling wave。那么我们设想一下，假设我的 adaptation 的 strength 呢比那个在那个 traveling wave boundary 偏右一点点，就什么意思呢？就是说在大多数情况下，我在 noise 驱动的情况下，我都是在我的 memory space 上做 local search 布朗运动。OK， 如果 by chance 呢，由于 noise 呢，我的 adaptation strength 呢会跨过这个 boundary 呢，那么我就会进入就相当于我的 adaptation 变大了，我这个系统失稳，那么我就会进入个 traveling wave， 相当于我在 memory space 呢，我就会做快速的游走，跳到另一个新的地方，然后 noise 又把我拉回来，我又在做local 运动。所以至少在行为上的话，这样一种 continuous attractor with noise adaptation 呢，能产生 Levy flight， 而那个数据呢我这还没写，就是我们还没发表，和那个我们在海马中的那个replay 的那个数据呢还吻合的挺好的，就是说在做用 Levy flight 的一个现象。 OK， 那么第二个那个状态呢，刚才我说了，如果当这个外界的 input 特别强的话，那么我这个网络的 bump 就逃不掉了， 就会有外界的 input 呢，就 drive 着呢，我就这样的 smooth 的叫 smooth tracking 跟着我走 ，OK。那么这个很好理解的，但是一个特别 interesting 的现象就是什么呢？如果我 intrinsic speed 比我外界的 input 的 speed 大的时候，就会有个特别有意思的现象，就会发现什么呢？就会发现我的 internal representation 呢 bump 呢会比我是在被你外界 input face locking 的 drive， 但是呢我的位置会超前于你，就说它会出现一些预测性的跟踪 anticipative tracking 那么这个 simulation 就演示的，就是说当你看刚开始的时候，这个红色是被蓝色 drive， 但是这个红色是 internal 的那个 bump 呢，会慢慢的领先于我外界的 drive， 而且我们也分析了，就是说在一个很大的速度范围之内，这个我 leading 的那个 distance 呢和我速度成正比，那么也就是说 leading 的时间呢是几乎是一个常数那么在老鼠的实验中他们就发现这个时间的确是一个大概在 ADN 这个那个区域的话，大概是25毫秒的样子。OK， 那么为什么这个 leading 就相当于一种预测了 anticipative tracking 为什么重要呢？其实是很好理解，就是说我们注意到我们大脑处理信息，我们都说这个 hierarchical model 是吧？我们信息 neural signal 是 hierarchical 一层一层传的。那么如果你完成一个 hierarchical level 传信息的时候，每一层传递你都有一个 delay 是吧？那么这样累积起来这个 delay 就很严重。所以说你需要补偿这个 delay， 那么就需要一个anticipation 的机制来补偿这个 delay 那么的确是呢，就是说我们大脑就有这样的一个delay 的一个delay compensation 的一个机制那么这个实验是这样做的他们让老鼠呢在一个转盘上，然后用手那个黑暗的屋子里不让它有 visual 的 cue， 然后我就用手呢拨动这个转盘顺时针或反时针这个旋转。然后我们知道这个大脑的那个头朝向的神经元就是一个 perfect continuous tractor， 然后我们记录 continuous tractor bump 的那个中心的位置，就相当于我 internal representation of head direction， 就会发现呢，这个 head direction 呢总是领先于大脑真实位置的大概一个25毫秒的位置。所以右边这个示意图，不管你是顺时针旋转也好，还是逆时针旋转也好，你的那个内在的头的朝向已经指向了大鼠头将要到达的20到25毫秒的位置，说它已经做提前预测了。那么这个提前预测很好理解，因为我们的信号的传输中有一个 delay 是吧？我们需要把这个 delay 给补偿了，这样才能保证我们才能大脑才能实时处理的运动的信息。OK， 那么如果我们用头的朝向的神经元是 continuous tractor， 如果我们再加上 adaptation 的话，我们这个模型呢就很好的解释这个我内在的 representation 怎么去领先于那个你外界真实的那个实时的那个 physical location 的问题。OK， 那么这儿顺便讲一句，就是说这是个生物学的模型但是大家也看到这 continuous tracker 它能做 tracking 是吧？如果你外界移动，就它就能 tracking。那么有很自然的想法是，我们既然能 tracking， 我为什么把它做类脑应用呢？是吧？你想这个 continuous tracker 做 tracking 它有这样的优点，首先它是网络做计算，我们跟 machine learning 算法不一样，我不需要一帧一帧图像去做 future extraction 来找到物体在哪儿，我根本不管这个，我就让这个 lateral bump 跟踪你这个物体，而且我是一个 network 的那个实现，所以说我不需要外界的电脑，我可以做在一个芯片上，所以说我可以具有很好的移动性。而且呢，在这没讲细节，就我们这个 CNN 的 tracking 呢，它的 leading 的时间是个常数，就是说你外界物体移动的速度快或慢都没关系，我都可以让它 leading 一个几乎是一个近似的一个常数，就是一个 constant leading time。而且这个所有的网络动力学都可以理论分析的，都有个 formal theory 来分析，我不需要大数据训练，你根据你的要求，我就把这个参数调好，我就能做得很好，是吧？而且这个东西对 noise 很 robust， 所以说我们就把这个东西拿来做了个运用。那么我们你用简单说，就是你摄像头拍下一个图像，一帧的图像，你把这个图像呢比如说在二维空间中 tracking 的物体，那么我就把它投影到一个二维空间中一个二维的 continuous tractor， 那么这个二维 continuous tractor 就产生一个 bump， 那么当你这个物体移动的时候，我的 bump 呢就跟着你走，是吧？我去做这个 tracking 那么这个呢我们和施路平老师就做了个合作，但施老师的工作包含很多很多部分但是其中一个部分就是说那个 tracking 的部分呢用的是 continuous tractor 那么这是一个同学在清华操场里跑的时候呢，后面一个无人驾驶自行车，有很多部分有 object detection， 那么其中的那个 tracking 部分就是用了 continuous tractor， 那么这个人在那个跑步的时候呢，我中间有 continuous tractor， 我的帮扶呢就一直在跟踪他。其实这个任务实际上有点让我 surprise， 因为这个自行车它总在晃，说那个图像特别的嘈杂。如果你第一次看，我都觉得这不可能做好。结果发现这个 attractor 它心智它真的把这个 noise 平均到很好，而且它一旦锁定目标以后呢，这个 bump 呢也不会受这个干扰。所以这个任务其实真的是挺难的，也实际上有点出乎我的 surprise。continuous tractor 把这个任务完成得很好。OK， 这就是一个插画了，一个非生物插画，就告诉个类脑计算这 continuous tractor 用。OK， 那么还有刚才说了，还有一个状态，就中间状态。如果这个外界的 input 那个input 的值的话是介乎那个不大不小的话，那么这个 intrinsic mobility 会导致这个帮扶想逃又逃不掉，所以它就会被来回的震荡，被这个外界 input drive， 这叫 oscillatory tracking。那么 oscillatory tracking 如果我们看这个帮扶的这个位置的话，那么它对比外界的位置的话，它就相当于这个看右边的图，这个那个对角线呢就表示外界的坐标的空间位置，它就沿着这个在这个时间在走，是吧？那么这个内在表象的位置呢，就会沿着这个来回的震荡。OK， 如果是相对位置，就把这个对角线给减掉了，就下面这个那么它就这个 attractor decode 出来的那个物体的位置呢，就会来着它来回震荡。这样一个震荡也很有生物学意义。那么它就和那个在2000年的Brad Pfeiffer 他们发现了一个海马中的，他们在那个在老鼠在做 locomotion 的时候呢，就记录老鼠海马中那个 neural population activity 表征的那个老鼠的位置，就发现那个老鼠的位置呢，它不是静止的，它会沿着这个老鼠移动呢，也是那个位置也是来回的震荡。所以你看上面是我们模型的来回震荡，和下面这个实验 data 来回震荡就吻合的很好，就是这个叫他们实验课叫做那个theta sequence 或 theta sweep。OK， 就相当于这样一个震荡现象。那么这是在 population level 上看到的。如果在神经 level 上的话，很早前那个 O'Keefe 就是那个 place cell 的发现者，得诺贝尔奖的那个 O'Keefe， 他就发现呢，实际上那个海马的神经元，它在老鼠进入它的那个 place field 的时候呢，它会产生 bursting activity， 就 theta 那个 bursting theta 那个 frequency 的 bursting activity， 而且在每个 theta cycle 呢，这个 neuron 的那个 bursting 呢，时间上会越来越靠前，说是一个 phase precession 的现象。那么这个之前呢也做了大量的工作。那么我们发现呢，这个 oscillator tracking 也能解释这个现象。那么这个 phase precession 呢，它是一个 single neuron 层次上的那个一个活动。那么如果刚才是那个 bump 呢转向了 neural population 的活动，那么我们现在来看一个神经元，假设一个神经元的位置就在那个这个原点这个位置，当我们看这个 bump 活动的时候，在原点位置这个单个神经元它的活动会是什么特性？你会看见在这个 bump 靠近它的时候，是吧？因为这个 bump 是来回的 sweep， 那么你就看见这个一来回震荡，那么这个单个神经元呢就会产生一个 bursting activity， 一起一伏的 bursting activity。OK， 那么我这儿没有时间细讲了。那么这个时候呢，你就可以理论分析它在那个每个那个震荡中它的那个相位那个时间点怎么随这个老鼠在它那个位置场中移动怎么随时间变化。我们就会发现呢，它既有像 phase precession 相位进动，也有 phase precession。那么这个和2000年的那个 Brad Pfeiffer 呢吻合得很好。就早期的大家发现都有 phase precession， 没有报道 phase precession。那么我们这个 oscillation 呢，它向前是 phase precession， 向后是 phase precession， 这就有点像那个多普勒效应一样。那么我们的模型就发现一个 phase precession。我们当时刚刚做的时候，我们还很困惑，因为实验报道只有 phase precession， 我们说我们怎么办呀？是不是搞错了？结果很高兴的看到那个2000年那个 Brad Pfeiffer 的 Science paper 发现，实际上是有 phase precession 的。所以说这个 oscillator tracking 也能很好的解释这个海马中神经元的活动。OK， 我这有太多细节我就没讲，我这顺便讲一句啊，这个 phase precision 为什么很重要 ？OK， 像 phase precision 呢，一个很可能的机制就是它把我们的我们在 temporal sequence 的记忆呢进行了时间的压缩。那什么意思呢？就说你看这个老鼠呢，比如说它在空间中跑动的时候，先进入空间神经元 A 的那个 place field， 它就神经元这个红色的神经元就产生个 neural activity 是吧？然后老鼠在移动。那么到下一个到 B 这个位置呢 ，A 这个神经元的那个相位进动了，说它移动到发放的时刻呢，移动到这个 theta 那个 cycle 的那个中间，那在 B 这个神经元就开始活动了。到了在 C 这个位置呢，它又再迁移，那个 B 也迁移 ，C 迁移，什么意思呢？就是说老鼠它可能经过空间中3个位置，它可能花了几秒钟的时间，但是通过这个相位进动的机制呢，它会把这经过3个空间位置呢。都压缩到一个 theta cycle， 就是100-200毫秒里面，那么就是个 STDP 的 time window， 所以它就可以把这个 sequence 的信息记录下来，就是说它保留了这个 temporal sequence 的那个 order 信息，但是那个 sequence 之间的那个时间的绝对信息它丢掉了。那么这个可能就是构造了我们一个场景 episodic memory 是吧？比如说你很多参加了生日 party， 你就会知道我早上起来干什么，什么时候吃蛋糕，大家什么时候有唱生日就是说大家离开，这具体的时间点记不住了，但是生日 party 上发生时间的顺序你会把它记住，就是 episodic memory。那么这个可能就会这种 phase precision 呢，它很有方性的命令，就是说可能会是一个压缩时间 temporal sequence 产生 episodic memory 的一个机制。OK。那么时间到了，我快速总结一下，我今天讲东西。所以我总的想 argue 说，我们大脑做计算是通过神经网络。那么为了 reliably and repeatably retrieve information 呢，这个信息需要表征在神经网络的attractor 中，是吧？那么 continuous attractor 是数学上理想化的一个网络模型，它不仅表征了 memory， 而且表征了 memory 之间的 relationship。那么如果你在 continuous 上考虑 adaptation 一种负反馈的机制的话，它就会让这个 attractor 失稳，就会让网络 attractor 呢就有很 rich 的 dynamics， 就是不仅有 attractor， 同时这个 attractor 还有来回的移动。那么通过这个 interplay between 这个 intrinsic mobility caused by adaptation 或 extrinsic mobility caused by external drive 呢，那么网络就会表现出很多引起的现象，比如说 traveling wave， 它可能是会导致我们快速的以 level fly 的方式做快速的 memory search， 那么它也可能产生 anticipatory tracking 来 compensate neural singular transmission delay， 它也可以产生一个 auxiliary tracking 来产生一个 比如说在 hippocampus 会导致 place cell 的phase precision and procession。我也快讲了一个例子，就是说这种 continuous tracker 呢也可以用在那个类脑计算中做那个目标的跟踪。那么因为这个工作涉及到我们过去很多年的工作，所以说有很多的合作者，他们在以不同的角度呢来帮助我把这个工作完成。比如说 CNN model 或数学分析呢是和我的那个最早期的日本的老板 Amari， 还有我在香港的一个长期的合作麦克王还有 Alan 冯合作的。那么预测跟踪呢主要是现在重庆大学的米圆圆还有麦克王和 Alan 冯一起合作的。Level Fly 呢主要是我组里的学生董行思、楚天浩和吉子龙做的。那么 Phase Pre 和 Procession 呢主要是楚天浩和那个吉子龙做的。OK， 最后谢谢大家。我的报告完了。
非常好，我们可能有一点点时间，大家看有没有什么问题？
不是时间到了吗？还有时间吗？
可能还有3分钟吧。
OK， 我急匆匆的赶，我还以为时间到了。
那行，那我们就下一个报告吧。我们请这个施白露老师来继续主持。施白露老师在吗？
好，
谢谢。
好的。
我退出分享的
退出来了
OK，
好的。非常感谢吴思老师So thanks Professor Si Wu very much for his wonderful talk. So now we switch to the next presentation. It's given by Professor Songting Li from Shanghai Jiao Tong University. So Song Ting is the associate professor in the Institute of Natural Sciences and the School of Mathematical Sciences at the Shanghai Jiao Tong University. So he has systematic training in mathematical science and computational neuroscience. He was a postdoc researcher in New York University, and his current research interest lies in computational neuroscience and brain-inspired computing. He has published very nice results in leading journals like PNAS and Cerebral Cortex. So let's welcome Song Ting to give us a talk entitled "With Mathematical Mechanism Underlying Hierarchical Timescales in Primate Neural Cortex." Yeah, Song Ting, please. Please unmute your microphone, Song Ting.
Okay, let me share my screen. I don't know why. Presenter mode now, you mean?
No, yeah, it's okay.
It's okay now.
It's fine now. Yeah, it's fine now. Yeah.
Okay, great. Yeah. First, I'd like to thank Seng and Bailu for inviting me here, and I'm very happy to have the chance to share with you our recent work on understanding the mechanism of a prominent phenomena in the cortex known as hierarchical timescales. So I'll start my talk by describing the phenomenon, the timescale hierarchy phenomenon, which has been observed recently in the cortex of many species. So we are all very familiar with the concept of spatial receptive fields of visual neurons. In the visual system, a visual neuron will respond to stimulus presented to a particular area in the visual field, and we call it a spatial receptive field of the neuron. And the size of the spatial receptive field becomes larger along the visual hierarchy. For instance, a V1 neuron's receptive field is generally larger than LGN neurons' receptive field, and V2 neurons' receptive field is even larger, which well agrees with the positions of these areas in the visual pathway. And the mechanism proposed by Huber and Wiesel has successfully explained this phenomenon, which is due to the convergent connectivity structure from an upstream area to a downstream area. For example, many LGN neurons send axons to one particular V1 neuron in a convergent way. So the receptive field of the V1 neuron is approximately the summation of the LGN neurons. So its receptive field size is larger than that of each individual LGN neuron. And in addition to study the spatial property of neurons, and recent experiments start to pay attention to the temporal property of neurons, which termed as timescales or temporal response window. And the timescale of a neuron describes how fast a neuron responds to external inputs or inputs from other areas. And the following experiment done in the Allen Institute provides one way to measure the timescale of neurons. In the experiment, a mouse is watching drifting gradient stimulus, and neural pixel is used to record neural activity across many areas. And this is a raster plot. As we can see here, each row corresponds to a neuron, and each dot is the spike. Okay, and then they calculate the autocoloration function of neurons in different areas, indicated by different colors here. And we can fit this autocorrelation function by using an exponential decay function. And decay time constant tau is defined as the time scale of neurons in a corresponding area. And interestingly, the results shows that the time scale of neurons also increases along the cortical hierarchy. For example, neurons in the early visual areas such as LGN and V1 have smaller time scales, indicating that these neurons respond very fast to external inputs, while neurons in higher order areas such as PM and AM have larger time scales, indicating that these neurons respond relatively slow to inputs. And the phenomenon that neuronal timescale hierarchy increases along the cortical hierarchy is actually quite universal for many species, including mouse, macaque, and human. And theory proposed that the hierarchical timescale phenomenon is actually functionally desirable, as neurons in early sensory areas need to respond to external input quite fast in order to transfer inputs quickly for information processing to downstream areas. And neurons in higher association areas, such as PFC, need to slow down a bit to have enough time to integrate inputs, accumulate evidence, and make decisions. So this phenomenon is quite new, so there are not much study about the mechanism about it. So next, I'm going to introduce a multi-regional model of the macaque cortex first that can well capture the phenomena of timescale hierarchy. And then, based on this model, we will perform some analysis to reveal the underlying mechanism later. So the model was first built in Xiaojing Wang's lab at New York University, and it models the neural activity of 29 cortical sensory and association areas. And there are two important features of the model that distinguish this model from other models of large-scale type. One is that the model takes into account precise quantitative connectivity pattern with weighted and directed information measured from Henry Kennedy's lab. And second, this model takes into account the areal heterogeneity in the model, which means in the model, each area is different. Okay, it's not identical. And the connectome of the macaque network is measured anatomically in terms of the fraction of labeled neurons. We call it FLN. So neurons in the source area will be colored if they send exons to target area by using some dye injected into a target area. And FLN value from one source area, say YI, for example, to a target area is defined as the number, just count the number of neurons sent projected to the target area over the total number of neurons that send projections to the target area. So it is a relatively, it's a normalized weight between 0 and 1. And the dynamics of the neural activity in the model, in each area, is modified from a canonical circuit model. So in the canonical model, there's one excitatory population and one inhibitory population in each area. And there are 4 types of interactions: E to E, E to I to E, and I to I. Okay, it's very classic. And the input currents will then be transferred into neuron fan rate through a rectified linear FI curve. And in addition to the above description, the macaque cortex model, as we have mentioned, actually modifies this one to add some heterogeneity of each area. In fact, so one substantial difference is that each area actually has a unique position along the areal hierarchical axis, from low-order sensory areas to high-order association areas. And the definition of hierarchy axis is actually not unique. Okay, there are many ways to define it. For example, the famous Van Essen diagram, as you see, gives one way of defining hierarchy based on the feed-forward and feedback connections, these patterns. Okay, and alternatively, recently in Henry Kennedy's lab, so they gave a more quantitative way to define hierarchy. So they used the similar idea as Van Essen did, that feed-forward connection comes from superficial layer of a source area, and feedback connection usually comes from a deeper layer. Okay, but they define it in a more quantitative way. I'll skip the details here, but if you are interested, you can ask or check their papers later for details. Okay, Another substantial difference across areas is that pyramidal neurons have different spine numbers across cortical areas. Okay, so dendritic spine is a microstructure on the dendrites that generally receives excitatory inputs from other pyramidal neurons. So the number of dendritic spine reflects the number of excitatory inputs of a neuron that a neuron receives. In Alston's lab, so they counted very carefully that in PFC, the number of dendritic spine of a pyramidal neuron is actually quite large. In contrast, in early visual areas, the number of dendritic spines is actually very small. Okay, so if we combine the dendritic spine count with area hierarchy, we can see from this figure, there's a clear positive correlation between them. Area with higher hierarchy usually have larger, the neurons usually have larger spine counts. Okay, and this clear positive correlation will be used in the macaque cortex model in the following slide. Okay, so here's the model. So each area follows a canonical circuit model with EI population interaction between them, except that now the E input strength, the E input strength to both populations is different now from area to area. Okay, so according to the experiment of spine count variability, we scale the E coupling strengths by the hierarchic value HI, okay, as they are positively correlated. And in addition, we also use the quantitatively measured FLN matrix to model the connectivity between areas. So it is a model that takes into account important anatomical features compared with previous versions of large-scale models. And by simulating this model, we can see that the phenomenon of timescale hierarchy will actually naturally emerge. For example, if V1 receives an external time-fluctuating inputs, it will respond with a very fast timescale, as we can see here. Okay, when the signal propagates to a high-order area in PFC, for example, this area will respond to a much slower timescale. And in addition, if we give another input, okay, if V1 neuron receives a pulse input, and if we pay attention to the time when the input is on and when the input is off, so each area show very different response speed. Okay, we can see V1 decays very fast, while in 24C, which is another area in prefrontal cortex, decays very slow. Okay, and we can also compute the autocorrelation function of each area as what they did in experiments, and extract the decay timescale by fitting this autocorrelation function with an exponential decay function. And we can see that the timescale approximately increases along the cortical hierarchy. But interestingly, it's not exactly the same as the hierarchy. Okay. And as the model can well capture the phenomena of timescale hierarchy, it provides us an opportunity to investigate the underlying mechanism, which is not obvious and trivial at first sight. Okay, later I'll explain why it's not obvious. So to better study the model, we first rewrite the model in the vector and matrix form to clean the notation, where the connectivity matrix now is the summation of two parts. We denote it as W, and it is written as the D matrix plus the F matrix. The D matrix represents the inter-areal connectivity, and the F matrix represents this long-range area-area interaction. Okay. And note the vector form of the model now becomes linear, because this is valid because the timescale hierarchy phenomena happens when all the neural activity are above the finite threshold. So the model is actually operate in the linear regime, which allows us to drop out this ReLU rectify the linear function. Okay. And for a linear model of a cortical network, we can actually analytically compute its solution when the network receives external inputs. And the solution shown here takes the form of the summation of eigenvectors of connectivity matrix W. And the red color, Vj, is the eigenvector, and the coefficients involves eigenvalues, which is colored by this blue color, lambda j. Okay. And here's a schematic illustration showing that, for example, if a network has 6 areas, it's a toy network, okay? And VI are the 3 eigenvectors, and AI are the corresponding coefficients determined by the corresponding eigenvalues. And the eigenvectors are time-independent, static. So it shows which area will be activated, actually. And while the eigenvalues determine how fast this coefficients changes with time. So in general, the activity of all areas shall evolve both fast and slow timescales determined by small and faster eigenvalues. As the summation here, you can see for any area I, you have lambda j for all areas. Okay, so the summation includes all the eigenvalues from small to big. So the eigenvalues will be, or the timescales will be mixed up. However, so if the eigenvectors have some patterns, for example, here in this case, if the eigenvector of faster timescale only has a few activated nodes, like these 2 blue dots here, okay, and they are not overlap with this eigenvectors with slow time constants, okay, slow time scale. The red ones, so you can see these 2 red dots are not overlap with the 2 blue dots here. And in this case, you will see that in the network, these 2 nodes will basically activated by fast time scales inherited from this V1 eigenvector. And these 2 areas will operate with very slow time scales inherited from this V3 eigenvector. Okay. So mathematically, timescale localization requires this localization and orthogonality of the eigenvectors. We required there are some patterns in these eigenvectors. And localization of eigenvector means that only a few nodes are activated. Okay, only a few nodes are significantly non-zero. Okay, while orthogonality means different eigenvectors are nearly but not strictly orthogonal to each other in order to not to mix up timescales determined by these eigenvalues. So that's the mathematical picture of this property of eigenvalues and eigenvectors. And then we calculate the eigenmode of the connectivity matrix to see if this is the case. And we focus on the excitatory populations. And we see 2 things for the excitatory populations, the corresponding eigenvectors. First is that on the left part of the eigenmatrix, we can see that the eigenvalues corresponding to very fast time scales, about 2 milliseconds. So time scale is the inverse of the eigenvalues, okay, mathematically. And also we see vanishing magnitude for the E population here. And for the right parts of the eigenmatrix, so eigenvalues corresponding to very slow timescales from hundreds to milliseconds to seconds. And we see weak localization and orthogonality here, okay? And to see the pattern more clearly, we can zoom in the blue box area here, and which shows that localized eigenmode of the E population. And localization of eigenmodes is expected to happen if areas are disconnected or sparsely connected. Now we have the puzzle, okay? Because the Macaque network is very dense, okay? It's densely connected with 65% connections. So why do we still have this localized eigenmode pattern, okay? That's the puzzle we want to solve. So to make our life easy, we start with the disconnected cortical network by cutting down all the long-range connection, okay? So there's no connection between areas now. So in this case, the connectivity pattern, connectivity matrix only includes local connections within each area denoted by matrix D here, okay? And showing on the right, okay? We have C4 diagonal matrix, submatrix, okay? And according to the model parameter adopted from experiments, we first observed that the coupling strength here to the I population, we can see much darker color, is much larger than the connection strength to the E population, due to the fact that the inhibitory neuron actually has a larger Fi slope. Therefore, we can identify a small parameter epsilon reflecting the distinct electrophysiological property of EI neurons and show that the interaction from I to I and I to E is order 1, which is very big. And the order from I to E and E to E is order epsilon. It's weak, okay? And we can further prove mathematically that the eigenvalues of each isolated area have two modes as well. One is of order epsilon, corresponding to timescale of hundreds of milliseconds, and the other is order 1, corresponding to timescale of 2 milliseconds, as observed previously. Okay, and the proof is straightforward by finding a P matrix here. Okay, to diagonalize the local connectivity matrix D, which I will skip the details here, but it's very straightforward. But the point here is the small parameter epsilon, reflecting the distinct property of EI neurons, leads to the slow and fast timescale pools as observed in previously. Okay, so now we can add back the long-range connectivity denoted by F, the FLN matrix, to the connectivity matrix W. Okay, and then we can perform similarity transform by using the same P matrix that diagonalized local connectivity matrix D previously. Okay, we use the same P so that we can get a new matrix gamma as a diagonal matrix lambda here, plus some perturbation matrix sigma. Okay, so now we can have another observation. The separation of time scales also the separation of scales also happen in the gamma matrix. Okay, which indicates there's another small parameter in the model. Okay, these are very important for our analysis. And that small parameter can be identified as delta, okay, which involves the coupling strands from long-range E to E, long-range E to I, and local I to I, and local I to E, okay. So what's the meaning of delta? Okay, so if we compute the steady state solution of two areas, say V1 drives V4, so in the steady state, we can see the output of V1 will be attenuated by the small variable delta, okay, when the signal propagates to V4. So the small delta indicates that the net input from V1 to V4 is very small due to the balance of E and I inputs, okay. But this balance is very interesting because this type of EI balance happens in each individual pair of areas rather than the cancellation of total E and I inputs from all areas to a target area. So it is called detailed balance, which was first proposed by Vogels and Eber for explaining signal gating in the brain. So with these two small variables here, we can write out the order of all the variables here, okay, in the eigen equation of the gamma matrix. And U and V is the eigenvector, and lambda is the corresponding eigenvalue, okay. So the advantage of studying the gamma matrix instead of the original connectivity matrix W is that the gamma matrix gives the an eigenvalue matrix, a diagonal matrix, lambda, which reflects the timescale of each area and its perturbation by long-range connections. And this will simplify our analysis, okay. And we notice that in the upper location, the upper perturbation block matrix is actually a higher order term, so it can be dropped, okay. And after we drop this term, we can decouple the system and get an equation only for the U parts. And U is, you can think about it very similar as the E population's activity, okay. And there are two cases. One is that U equals to 0, which is a very trivial solution for this equation. And another one is more interesting. So U can be viewed as the eigenvector of a diagonal matrix lambda, okay, which is natural basis. Okay, we know that the eigenvector of a diagonal matrix is a natural basis, 1, 0, 0, 0, and 0, 1, 0, 0. Okay, only one element is 1. Plus a perturbation matrix, okay, sigma. So U has the property that with one element to be order 1, denoted by EK, plus other orders with a small perturbation delta here, okay. So mathematically, it takes the form like this. And if we write out the expression of the first order approximation of U, then we can see that U1 is the perturbation element over the difference of the spectrum gap, the difference of eigenvalues, okay. Therefore, in order to make the perturbation analysis valid, we require the high order term, the first order term, be much smaller than the zeroth order term, okay? So U1 has to be order 1. In that case, we require that the spatial gap should be larger than the perturbation elements, okay? And the spatial gap originates from areal heterogeneity, HI, indicating that areal heterogeneity is very important for timescale hierarchy. Okay, not only to provide a pool of intrinsic timescales for all areas, okay, but also this spectral gap can be used to against the mixture of timescales from other areas via long-range interactions. So long-range interactions can be strong as long as the spectral gap is large enough to against it. Okay. And so far, we have proved that for the gamma matrix, the similarity transformation of W, its eigenvectors have weak localization and orthogonal property because of this form. Okay. And finally, we can also prove that when we transform back to the original space, the eigenvectors of the original matrix also have the same property. And the perturbation analysis gives a very well approximation of the eigenvalue matrix patterns, eigenmatrix patterns. Okay. So here, the upper one is the original eigenmatrix, and the lower one is the obtained from the perturbation analysis. We can see they are very highly similar to each other. Okay. So now let me briefly illustrate the idea of analysis if you don't like the math detail. Okay. So we first convert neural activity from REI, the firing rate space, to the UV space, which is the linear combination of RE and I, by performing a similarity transform. Okay. And then we cut the interaction from VJ to UI by dropping the weakest interaction. Okay. So the system can be decoupled, only have this U interaction left. Okay. And then we can show that U has the property of weak localization and orthogonality. Okay. Due to the spectral gap and the detailed balance. And so is RE when we transform back to the original space. And in analysis, we identified the three important conditions. That's actually the take-home message. First is the small parameter epsilon, which reflects the distinct electrophysiological properties between E and I neuronal populations that creates the pools of slow and fast time scales here. And also another variable, small variable delta, okay, that reflects the detailed balance between E and I inputs from each area to area pathway. And the third one is the spectral gap induced by HI. So it's a macroscopic gradient with synaptic excitation. That area actually has heterogeneity. Okay. So to conclude the talk, we have identified these three circuit properties, as we have mentioned previously, that are very important for timescale hierarchy. But here I also want to point out that these are just sufficient conditions applied to this model. Actually, our recent work has shown that we can actually identify a sufficient and necessary condition for ensure this timescale hierarchy. Okay, and this work, I would like to thank my collaborator Xiaojing Wang when I was a visitor in 2020 to visit his lab, and we discussed about this project. And finally, I would like to thank you all for your attention.
Oh, hi. I actually have a question. Can I ask?
Yeah, sure.
Hello, can you hear?
Yeah, sure. Can you hear me?
So actually, I think one of the really good feature of this your model is that you have a detailed balance. So actually, many of the Wilson-Cohen and previous models are not at the critical state, which I think is a very important feature of the brain. So I wonder if you can elaborate a little bit on that. Well, is a wholly connected network still in a critical state?
The critical state. Okay. Yeah, that's a very good point. Actually, we find that critical state is at least close to the criticality is very important for this phenomenon as well. Because in the brain, we have some areas showing very slow time scales, like seconds. Okay, so if we study this linear model, it requires the eigenvalues to be very close to zero. Okay, so that actually reflects the network is close to criticality. And also, we find that, for example, in this model and other models, if we want to fit the experimental data, for example, the resting state function connectivity, only when the network parameter is in the criticality regime, close to the criticality regime, okay, then it matches the resting state function connectivity very well. All this evidence shows that our brain network should be close to criticality. Also for this timescale hierarchy phenomenon as well. Yeah, I don't know if I answered your question, but I agree this is a very important important factor and feature we need to consider in the modeling.
Yeah, thanks. We're actually working on something related to this, so we'll communicate later. Thanks.
Okay, sure, yeah.
Okay, so thanks, Songting.
Thank you. So I'll quit.
Maybe I have another question. So,
okay.
So from your talk, you found out that the spectral gap is very important. So
right.
Do you predict that you can observe some discretized distribution of this from the data?
Distribution of the spectrum?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. That's also a very good point. So right now, our model is a discrete version, right? We have just a couple of nodes. So we have a finite number of ODEs. So we have a finite number of spectrals. So the spectral gap is actually discrete. But if we take the limit, for example, if we make the resolution even smaller and smaller, then we will have a continuous like this neural field model. And in that case, what will be the spectral gap of the neural network? We haven't studied that yet, but this phenomenon is very similar as the well-known phenomena in physics known as Anderson localization. Probably you're thinking about that picture. Okay, so we actually try to link this phenomenon with that phenomenon, which also shows in some particular cases, you will have localized eigenfunction and discrete this eigenvalue. Okay, but we haven't taken a look deeper into that. Okay, thank you for your question.
Thank you, Songting. Yeah. So let's move on to the next talk from Professor Yuanyuan Mi. So Professor Mi is now in the Center for Neurointelligence, Chongqing University. She received a PhD degree from Beijing Normal University and later worked as postdoc associate in Weizmann Institute in Israel and Columbia University in the States. So her research area is computational neuroscience. She's interested in using computational model to elucidate general principles of brain function at neural circuit level, especially the neural mechanism for processing dynamic information, including working memory, spatial temporal information, coding, and motion prediction. So let's welcome Professor Mi with her talk on a synaptic story of working memory. Yes, yeah, please.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for your introduction and your invitation. So I will share my screen. Okay, can you see my slides?
Yes, very well.
OK， 今天我的报告也会用中文，然后再次感谢肖老师的介绍。然后今天我想介绍一下我跟我的合作者在工作记忆的神经计算、突出计算机制方面的研究。工作记忆呢，主要是指我们大脑对外部输入信号的一个暂时的存储和加工。我们的视觉加工、言语理解、情景记忆等几乎所有的高级认知功能呢，都需要调用我们的工作记忆。那么关于工作记忆它背后的神经计算机制，有两种不同的观点。一种观点是认为呢，就是说记忆信息其实是存储于神经元的持续发放活动当中。另外一种观点就会认为呢，记忆信息其实是存储于被短时增强了的突触连接的强度当中。首先呢，我先简要介绍一下工作记忆存储于 persistent activity 中的观点。实验研究发现呢，就是说当猴子在执行工作记忆相关的任务过程当中呢，就是说当刺激呈现的时候，编码这个刺激的神经元群呢，会快速产生一个同步发放的行为，以实现对这个刺激的一个表征。这里黑色的点呢，其实就代表神经元产生动作电位的时刻。当刺激撤掉之后，神经元群呢，我们大家可以看到还可以维持着就是比较高的一个发放率。只有当猴子完成了工作任务相关的任务的过程之后呢，就是说编码这个刺激的神经元群，它就会恢复到了一个自发的活动状态。那么因此呢，从这个图当中我们就可以看到，在信息保持的阶段，工作记忆可存储于神经元群的这样子的一个持续发放活动当中。下面呢，我将详细介绍一下工作记忆存储于 存储于突触被短时增强上的突触的一个理论，这是 Misha Sodis 教授于08年所提出来的观点。它的基本思想呢，其实是强调神经系统它可能采用了一种更经济的一个编码方式，也就是说它可以将记忆信息呢存储于突触连接的短时增强上，然后这个呢可以通过突触短时程可塑性来实现。突触短时程可塑性呢，主要是指的是神经元之间的突触连接强度随着突触前神经元的一个发放活动的动态变化而发生的一种动态变化。突触短时程可塑性呢，它分为突触短时程增强和衰减的一个效应。因为今天呢，就是说我所介绍的两个工作都是利用了突触短时程可塑性的一个计算功能，所以说我在这里就会详细介绍一下突触短时程可塑性。从这个图当中我们可以看到，突触前神经元每产生一个动作电位呢，它的神经递质的释放概率 U 就会增加，使得神经元之间突触连接的这个强度就会增加，产生了突触短时程增强的效应。同时呢，突触前神经元它的神经递质的 resource 的比例 X 呢就会下降， X 的下降呢就会导致神经元之间突触连接强度的一个降低，导致了突触短时程衰减的一个效应。然后我们在这里可以看到，就是说当突触前神经元产生动作电位之后，然后突触短时程增强的效应的 U 呢，就会在一个 tau f 的时间段内，它慢慢的decay 到它的 baseline 0，然后突触短时程衰减的效应呢，它会在一个 tau d 的时间段内，慢慢的恢复到它的 baseline 1。然后这里呢是突触短时程增强和衰减效应的一个数学表达。然后基于突触短时程可塑性效应， Misha 等人他们进一步构建了具有突触短时程可塑性的一个脉冲神经网络模型。这个神经网络当中呢，有多群不同的神经元群，然后每一个神经元群呢，它可以编码不同的刺激信息。然后研究就发现呢，当一个刺激信息呈现的时候，编码这个刺激信息的神经元群，它就会产生同步发放的行为来去表征这个刺激信息。然后这个黑色的点呢，就是代表编码这个刺激信息的神经元群它所产生动作电位的一个时刻，这个绿色的点呢，就代表编码其他刺激的神经元群产生动作电位的一个时刻。在这里我们可以看到，当刺激撤掉之后，神经元群的活动呢，会再次恢复到了一个自发活动的一个状态。但是大家可以看到，就是说虽然神经元群恢复到了一个自发活动的状态，但是呢，在这个信息维持的阶段，编码刚刚呈现的这个刺激的神经元群内部呢，它的突触连接强度 U 和 X 的乘积呢，相对于其他的神经元群来说却是增强了的。那么这个时候呢，当外界呈现一个 non-specific 的一个 recalling 的信号的时候，也就是说这时候网络当中所有的神经元群呢，都会接受一个相同的外界刺激。那么负责编码刚才所呈现的这个刺激的神经元群，它就会借助自身被增强了的突触连接的强度，会再次产生一个同步发放，然后将这个刺激信息呢被 retrieve 出来。那么由此可见呢，我们就可以看到，在信息维持的阶段呢，记忆信息其实是存储于神经元之间的突触连接的短时程增强效应上了。那么现在的研究表明呢，就是说工作记忆的突触理论呢，它也符合现在已有的大量的实验数据，因为它在计算上呢也更节能。但是要完全丰富和完善这个理论呢，还有很多一些没有解决的关键的科学问题。比如说工作记忆它其实是包含了我对外界信息的一个暂时的存储与加工，那么它就包含了比如说工作记忆的存储它的容量是有限的。另外一个问题就是说工作记忆它可不可以被动态的调控。那么在这个报告当中呢，我就将介绍我和我的合作者如何利用工作记忆的突触理论来解释这两个科学问题背后的一个神经计算机制。首先呢，我想先介绍工作记忆有限容量的一个神经计算机制。就是大量的心理物理实验研究就表明呢，其实工作记忆它不同于常识记忆的，工作记忆的容量是有限的，大约一般为14个。 比如说在这个心理物理实验当中，当屏幕上呈现的具有不同颜色和空间位置的方块的数目一旦小于等于4个的时候，我们对这个刺激的记忆的准确率几乎是为100%的。但是当方块的数目一旦超过4个之后，我们的记忆准确率就会急剧下降。那么工作记忆容量它背后的神经计算机制是怎么样的呢？就是说在介绍我们的解决方案之前呢，我想先介绍 Lisman 他在96年所提出来的一个 hypothesis。Lisman 他就认为，就是说多个记忆信息呢，它可以存储于这种嵌套的西塔伽马耦合的这样子的一个周期震荡活动当中。其中呢，每个记忆信息呢，它可存储于这样子的一个伽马频段的一个震荡膜包当中，它通过神经元的一个同步发放来表证。那么不同的记忆信息呢，它就存储于这个西塔波包的这个慢波的不同的相位上。然后，那么这个西塔频段的波包，它可以容纳的伽马类五波包的数目呢，就决定了工作记忆的容量。这个呢，与早期的心理物理实验的预测结果其实是相吻合的。我个人就特别喜欢 Lisman 的这个观点，觉得特别 make sense。所以说我在以色列工作期间和 Misha Sodis 教授合作，基于他所提出来的工作记忆的突出的计算理论，同时也结合了 Lisman 的假说，我们就想尝试从理论上求解出工作记忆的一个有限容量。那么理论解析的优势呢，它其实就在于它允许我们对工作记忆的容量，比如说它与神经突触层面，或者是神经元层面，或者是 circuits 层面的一个参数的依赖关系做出一个预测，而这些预测呢，可能会通过未来的神经生物学实验呢来被检测。由此呢，我们就构建了一个平均场论的神经网络模型来研究工作记忆的有限容量这个问题。在我们的模型当中呢，每一个兴奋性神经元群呢，它其实就编码不同的一个记忆信息。然后每个神经元群内部呢，它其实是具有突触短时程可塑性效应的。在这里我们可以看到，然后每个兴奋性神经元群呢，它都与一个抑制性的神经元群相连接。然后这个抑制性神经元群它就有2个作用。第一个呢，它就是可以保持整个网络处于兴奋和抑制相平衡的状态，网络不会产生一个爆发式的发放。另一个方面呢，它也会提供了一个全局的抑制作用。然后这个全局的抑制作用呢，它就可以引发所有的兴奋性神经元群，它会有一个相互竞争，那么就可以保证在每一个时刻只有一个记忆信息可以被表达。那么在我们的神经网络模型当中，每个兴奋性神经元群我们主要是有3个动力学变量来描述的。然后在这里的 H 呢，就是代表这个神经元群的一个突触电流。U 呢，刚才已经介绍过了，是代表突触短时程增强效应。X 是代表突触短时程衰减的效应。套 F 和套 D 呢，分别是突触短时程增强和衰减效应的一个时间常数。IB 呢为背景电流，这里其实就代表了神经系统的一个注意力水平。IE 呢其实就代表了像网络夹嘴记忆信息的一个外部输入信号。然后为了阐明我们所提出的机制，我们选择了与实验上所测得的我们的 prefrontal cortex 当中兴奋性神经元之间突触连接的一个相吻合的一个参数。这是因为工作记忆它其实主要是由 prefrontal cortex 来执行的。那么我也借鉴了就是 Misha 他所采用的就是 STF dominant 的一个参数，套 F 远大于套 D。然后这个就意味着呢，就是说突触前神经元每产生一个 spike 之后，神经元的突触连接强度它都可以在很长的时间内维持一个较大的数值。那么基于我们构建的神经网络模型，然后当刺激呈现的时候呢，编码这个刺激的神经元群就会产生一个 population spike。那么刺激撤掉之后，这个神经元群呢就会产生一个自发的一个周期性的同步发放的行为，以存储这个记忆信息。那么我们依次将4个不同的记忆信息呢加载到了神经网络当中，我们就发现当记忆信号呈现的时候呢，相应的神经元群都会产生这样子的一个同步发放。然后记忆信息撤掉之后呢， 4个神经元群呢，它就会按照它们加载时的顺序，依次再次产生这样子的同步发放行为，以保存这个记忆信息。这个现象呢，其实就符合了 Leisman 的假说，就是说多个记忆信息它其实是存储一个西塔伽马耦合的一个震荡活动当中的。每个记忆信息呢，它其实是存在于一个西塔震荡的不同的一个相位上。当我们依次加载更多的信息，在这里比如说加载5个不同的信息的时候，我们就发现刺激撤掉之后，只有4个神经元群会按照它们加载时的顺序再次产生 population spike。那这个现象其实就意味着，就是说在现有的参数下呢，网络的工作记忆的容量就是为4。那么到底是什么样的因素影响了工作记忆的容量呢？就是说其实我们本身已经采用了简化的平均场论的模型了，但是这个平均场论的模型大家刚才也看到了，它其实也包含了一个大量的参数，所以说我们还是需要寻求我们通过理论解析的方式来去揭示工作记忆容量有限背后的它的一个计算机制。从这个图当中我们就可以看到，就是说刚才也说了，网络它其实是采用了一个西塔和伽马耦合的一个耦合震荡的策略来存储了多个记忆信息。然后这里呢，就是说单个神经元它所产生同步震荡活动的这个样子的一个最大的周期呢，是一个 Tmax， 它大约是在西塔频段，然后相邻2个同步发放的神经元之间的时间间隔呢，大约是在伽马频段。那么我们就可以看到，就是说工作记忆的容量其实就是由这个一个震荡周期内所能容纳的population spike 的最大的数目来决定的，也就是由 Tmax 除以 Ts 来决定的。然后我们利用了非线性动力学的一个分析方法，逐一求解了这个西塔和伽马震荡频率的一个数学表达。然后那这样子我们最终就可以得到工作记忆容量的一个数学表达。在这里我们可以看到，工作记忆的容量它其实是与突触短时长衰减的时间常数与单个神经元的时间常数的比值成正比的。然后另外一个呢，就是说在这里有一个临界的背景电流，只有当背景电流高于这个临界值的时候，工作记忆的容量呢才能是有限值，否则呢就是为0。下面我们就逐一验证我们结论的一个有效性。就是说为了验证第一个结论的有效性呢，我们采用了不同的突触短时长增强和衰减的时间常数，还有单个神经元的时间常数的一个组合。然后左边呢，这是我们理论推导的结果，右边呢，这是我们 simulation 的结果。然后在这里我们可以看到，我们的理论分析呢，其实就定性的抓住了工作记忆容量的一个计算特性。记忆容量呢，随着tau的增加而逐步的减少，随着tau f 和tau d 的增加呢而逐步增加。然后为了验证我们理论模型的一个普适性，我们进一步构建了一个脉冲神经网络模型。然后在这里我们可以看到，在没有任何刺激呈现的时候，网络当中所有的神经元它都处于一个自发的活动状态。然后在这个时刻呢，我们先后依次加载10个不同的刺激信息，然后每个刺激信息呈现之后，这个神经元群都会产生同步发放来表征这个刺激信息。然后所有的刺激信息呈现之后，我们看到最终只有4个不同的信息可以被保存下来。由此可见呢，工作记忆容量的确是有限的。然后我们进一步研究也发现，就是说当神经元的常数增加的时候，工作记忆的容量呢会降低，随着tau f 和tau d 的增加，工作记忆的容量呢也会随之增加。然后下面就是说，为了验证我们第2个结论的一个有效性呢，我们就计算了，就是说在不同的注意力水平上，网络可以存储比如说不同个记忆信息的一个概率。比如说这里 P3 就是说这个网络可以存储3个不同的记忆信息的一个概率是多少。然后在这里我们就可以发现，只有当背景电流呢大于 2.45 这个 critical 的值的时候，然后多个记忆信息呢才可以存储在这个神经网络模型当中。然后并且我们发现，随着注意力水平的增加呢，网络所存储的信息容量也会随之增加。但是呢， 这个信息容量呢，它也会有一个 maximal 的值，所以说在这里我们也验证了，就是说，工作记忆它的一个需要有一个临界电流。在这里呢，我就先做一个小结，然后在我们这个工作当中呢，我们主要采用了就是说神经系统利用了这样子的一个西塔伽马耦合震荡的一个策略来去存储多个记忆信息，然后我们同时基于呢工作记忆的一个突出计算机制，构建了一个平均场论的神经网络模型，推导出了就是说和实验数据相吻合的工作记忆容量的一个数学表达。然后我们发现就是说在 MISA 的工作记忆突出计算理论当中呢，它所阐明的一个观点就是说，工作记忆主要是存储在突出短时长增强效应的。然后在这里的确我们也是利用了这一个观点，但是呢，我们又发现一个新的一个规律，就是说虽然记忆信息存储于突出短时长增强上，但是呢，工作记忆的容量呢，其实是由突出短时长衰减的这个时间常数来主导的。下面呢，就是我会介绍另外一个工作，是我和北京大学罗欢老师最近所合作的一个课题，它是关于我们如何有效的，其实在你毫无意识的一个条件下来偷偷的去操控你的工作记忆。然后在介绍我们的工作记忆的一个动态操控范式之前呢，我想先介绍一下，就是说已有的研究他们传统的研究 sequential working memory 的一个实验范式。然后在这个传统的实验范式当中呢，屏幕当中会依次呈现具有不同的颜色和 orientation 的这样子的一个短棒。然后屏幕呈现了这两个不同的记忆信息之后呢，在经过一个 delay 的 period 之后，然后受试呢需要根据屏幕当中所呈现的这个 cue 来去 report 第一个或者是第二个刺激的这个角度的信息。然后已有的大量的实验研究表明呢，就是说在这样子的一个实验范式当中，受试的 performance 呢一般会呈现一个近义效应，也就是说我们人类受试呢一般会对屏幕上最后所呈现的这个记忆信息呢，它的记忆准确度会更高，是一个近义的消息。那么在这个传统的实验范式的基础上呢，我的合作者罗涵老师呢，他其实就提出了一个非常 smart 的一个方法，他提出了就是说一个操控一个全新的动态操控工作记忆的方法。那他的这个方法主要是这样子的，就是说他在记忆保持阶段呢，他就去通过操控与 orientation 这个 feature 相绑定的这样子的一个 color 的信息，然后呢，它在屏幕上就会呈现两个，就是说随着时间变化的这个 color 的亮度序列，然后这个随时间变化的这个 color 的亮度序列呢，它就可以在受试无意识的条件下去操控它的一个对记忆信息的一个准确度。然后在这里呢，我就稍微的介绍一下，就是说在信息呈现的这个阶段呢，我们的记忆策略一般是会将这个记忆信息的它的几个不同的 feature， 比如说在这个实验范式当中，它的 color、orientation， 然后以及它的空间的 spatial location， 然后这三个 feature 呢绑定在一起，形成一个 chunk 来去记忆这个刺激信息的。那么呢，就是说在记忆阶段呢，就是说这个 color 这个 feature 呢，它自然的就会携带了 partial 的这个 orientation 的一个 feature 的一个信息。那么下面呢，我就逐一介绍一下几种不同的操控工作记忆的方式，然后以及这个方式它所呈现的受试所呈现的一个记忆的一个 performance。然后首先呢，我先介绍一个 baseline 的条件，受试所呈现的一个记忆的条件呢。然后首先呢，我先介绍一个 baseline 的条件，受试所呈现的一个记忆。 在 baseline 条件下呢，每个亮度系列的它的亮度值呢，其实是一个相互独立的一个高斯白噪声，也就是说两个闪烁的这个亮度系列，它在时间上是没有任何的相关性的。然后呢，实验结果就显示呢，在这种 baseline 的条件下，受试者他仍然维持了一个非常显著的一个静音效应。那么下面呢，就是说我就介绍几种其他的不同的条件。首先我先介绍就是说在同步条件下呢是这两个 probe 的颜色亮度系列，它在每一个时刻它所呈现的亮度值是 totally 相同的。那么事实上呢，就是说同步条件的这两个 probe 的亮度序列呢，它在时间上其实就已经有了相关性，然后它的时间的相关性在0时刻相关性最强。那么实验结果就表明呢，一旦我们加上了这种具有时间相关性的这种 probe 的序列呢，它就会破坏了受试的这样子的一个静音效应，使得它变成了一个首音效应。也就是说呢，在这种条件下，受试者反而会对第一个呈现的刺激会记忆的更准确了，它的 performance 会更好。但是呢，在这种条件下，它的首音效应呢并不是特别显著的。下面我就想介绍两个介绍 order reversal 的这样子的一个条件。在这里呢有两种不同的条件，一种是 same order， 另外一种呢是 reverse order。然后在 same order 的情况下呢，也就是说第一个呈现的这个刺激的亮度序列呢，它会提前于第二个呈现刺激的严肃亮度序列大约200毫秒。也就是说这两个亮度序列在时间上有非常强的正相关性。然后另外一个条件呢是一个 reverse condition。那在这个 reverse condition 条件下呢，也就是说第一个呈现的这个刺激的亮度序列，它会滞后于第二个呈现刺激的这个亮度序列200毫秒。也就是说这两个亮度序列它在时间上就会具有一个很强的一个负相关的一个效应。那我们就实验就发现，如果在这两个 probe 序列上一旦考虑了它非常强的时间相关性呢，然后受试的 performance 就会有了很显著的变化。然后实验结果就显示呢，就是说在这个正序的条件下，受音呢它仍然维持了一个显著的静音效应，但是呢这个显著的静音效应呢它又会被 enhance。然后我们就发现在逆序的条件下呢，受试者的静音效应被 totally 破坏掉了，然后会呈现一个首音的效应，并且这种首音效应呢是非常显著的。然后在这里呢，我就稍微再提一下，其实在另一种条件下，不管是 baseline 还是说在时间上有非常相关性的 same order 或者是 reverse order 的这样子的一个 condition， 然后我们人类受试呢，其实它都很难感知到这个闪光序列的异同的。所以说呢，就是说罗汉老师他所提出来的这一套动态操控工作记忆的方法呢，其实是在受试者无意识的条件下完成的。然后下面我就想介绍一下，就是说动态调控工作记忆它背后的一个神经计算机制是怎么样的。然后在这里呢，我利用了连续心子神经网络模型呢，来去模拟我们神经系统对心理物理实验范式当中，就是说 feature orientation 这个 feature 进行表征和存储。刚才王老师他已经介绍到了连续心子神经网络模型的，它是我们神经系统对连续变量编码的一个正则化的一个模型。然后在这个模型当中呢，所有的神经元呢，它都会有自己所偏好的 orientation， 然后所有的神经元呢，会按照它自己所偏好的这个 orientation 呢依次排列。然后神经元和神经元之间的这个连接呢，我们考虑了突触短时长可塑性效应。然后与上一个工作的参数相同，就是说参数设置也是相同的。在这里突触短时长增强的效应呢，它的时间长数其实是远大于突触短时长衰减效应的。同时呢，我们在这里也考虑了一个 global inhibitory 的 neuron inhibitory neuron pool。然后这个抑制性神经元群呢，它的作用呢，其实它也是引发所有的兴奋性神经元群的一个相互竞争，然后使得就是说每个时刻只有一个信息可以被表达。 首先呢，我们就先模拟，就是说在信息维持阶段没有这个动态闪烁的 probe 的一个情况，然后我们网络的一个performance 是怎么样的。然后我们研究就发现呢，就是说在信息呈现的刺激呈现的阶段，就是每个不同角度的刺激呈现的时候呢，都会引发相应的神经元群，它会产生一个同步的发放。然后刺激撤掉之后，编码这两个刺激的神经元群呢，它就会逐步进入了一个自发活动的一个状态。但是呢，我们在这里可以看到，由于它编码第二个刺激的神经元群呢，它是后出现的。那么在这里我们就可以看到它的突触连接的强度呢，这个神经元群内部它的突触连接权重就会高于编码第一个刺激的神经元群。然后并且我们看到在统计上来看也的确是如此的。然后根据Misha 他所提出来的工作记忆的突触理论呢，它就表明神经元群之间的突触连接强度越大，信息就会被记忆的更加准确。那么因此呢，就是说在 recalling 阶段，我们就可以计算出受试的记忆效果呢，的确是呈现了一个静音的一个效果。下面呢，我就先在介绍其他的一个 condition 的一个工作记忆调控机制之前呢，我先简要介绍一下，就是说在信息维持阶段，我们所采用的所呈现的这个动态闪烁的 probe， 它在我们模型当中的一个数学表达。由于 probe 刚才已经介绍到了，这个 probe 的颜色的信息呢，它携带了 partial 的 orientation 的信息。那么也就是说，相当于我们在模型当中呢，添加了一个非常 weak 的一个 noisy 的 input。然后这种很 weak 的 noisy 的 input 呢，它首先不会引发神经元群这种大规模的一个发放，然后神经系统它的神经元不会产生大规模的神经发放了，那也就是说受试它本身就不会意识到 probe 呈现的时候他们再去看 orientation 这一个 feature。那么呢，就是说我们就可以看到，我们考虑了这个 probe 的信号在 baseline 的条件下，然后在信息维持阶段，神经元群呢它会产生一个偶发的一个震荡。但是呢，这个偶发的震荡呢，它并不会引发神经元群两个神经元群它自身的突触连接强度的一个相对大小。所以说我们就可以看到在 recalling 阶段呢，然后受试的静音效果呢就可以得到一个很好的维持，是一个显著的一个静音效应。那么我们就想看一下在same order 和 reverse order， 然后在时间上具有很强相关性的这样子的一个 probe 的信号，它是如何 manipulate 受试的信息受试的 performance。 然后在这里我们就可以看到，在正序的条件下，在时间上具有很强的这样子的一个正相关的两个 probe 的信号的呈现，它会使得受试一直无意识的会看到两个刺激信号一直被反复的加载，然后它就会不断的去强化神经元群之间的突触连接强度的一个相对大小，然后这个是统计的结果。所以说我们就可以看到，在 recalling 阶段，受试的一个静音效应它就会被增强了。那么在逆序条件下呢，它就相当于 probe 的呈现呢，就会相当于受试在无意识的情况下一直在反复的接受这种相反顺序的一个刺激的信息。那么在长时间的一个情况下呢，神经元的突触连接强度的一个相对大小就会被翻转了，所以说他们的工作记忆效果呢就会被翻转了，然后就被调控成了一个显著的一个首因效应了。然后最后在这里我就 summarize 一下我们工作记忆操控它背后的一个原理，就是外部的这种 noisy 的一个动态的干扰呢，它不能够引发神经元群的一个大规模的发放，但是呢，因为它与被记住物体的这样子的一个弱关联，它可以通过突触短时程可塑性来去改变神经元群之间的它的突触连接强度的一个相对大小，然后进而改变影响了神经系统对不同物体的一个回忆的准确度。前面的计算结果显示，就是说我们构建的神经网络模型呢，它与心理物理实验的结果是相吻合的， 但是呢，我们的模型它其实还可以做进一步的一个预测。然后在这个工作当中呢，我们就预测了工作记忆它可以被有效调控的那个时间窗口呢，它其实是由突触短时长衰减的时间常数来决定的。然后在这里我们以正序的 same order 这个条件来去介绍，然后当亮度序列的关联呢接近0毫秒的时候，它其实就相当于同步条件，所以说在这里呢静音效果就会被破坏，它是不是一个显著的一个静音首音效果。然后当它的时间相关强度特别大的时候，那它其实就类似于一个 baseline 的条件，所以说在这里呢就是一个静音效果。然后只有当这个时间动态操控的这个时间窗口呢处于1/2套递到套递的时间窗口内，然后它的静音效果呢才会被 enhance， 然后同时呢在 reverse 的条件下，然后这里也会出现一个非常显著的一个首音效果。最后我就 summarize 一下，就是说我的合作者他是发展了一套自下而上的一个工作记忆的操控方法，然后我们呢是基于工作记忆的突出理论构建了神经网络模型来去解释了它背后的一种操控机制。然后最后感谢一下我的合作者，工作记忆有限容量的这个神经计算机制是我和 Misha Saldis 教授共同完成的。工作记忆操控这个工作呢主要是跟北大罗宽老师来合作的，然后李佳琦和黄巧丽是这个工作的第一作者。然后最后感谢大家，我的报告完毕。
Okay, thanks Yan for her nice talk. So maybe one question. So is your theory predict that if you want to learn memorize things well, we should repeat a sequence in a random order? Is that right?
对，应该可以是这样子的。Okay.
Thanks. So due to the time limitation, we should move on to the next speaker. So let's invite Professor Song Sen to introduce the speaker. Thanks.
大家好，对，非常高兴啊，我今天那个上午听下来，感觉好像大家的这个报告还衔接的非常好，必须说这是老天爷安排的，不是我安排的。这个我当时只觉得这几位都做得很好，所以把他们邀请过来了。那下一位呢，我们会有一个比较偏认知方向的这个报告，是请这个北大的张航老师来介绍。然后张航老师说的这个话题呢也非常有意思，是关于这个贝叶斯模型，就有点跨到这个计算的那块去了。和我们在大脑中到底有多大程度上可以被实现？那请我们欢迎张航老师。张航老师上来了吗
？Yeah. Thanks for the introduction. I'm just starting the screen sharing. Sorry. Okay. Could you see my screen?
Yes, no problem.
Okay, let's start. The logo of our lab is a base rule in the form of a brain, which highlights an important part of human life, probability, and how it's represented and computed in the human brain. The idea that probability is so important in human life dates back to Laplace. Indeed, life is all about probability. For example, economic decisions like investment is simply to choose among probability distributions of gains and losses. In perceptual tasks, such as reading the CT scan of a patient, the doctor needs to judge the occurring probability of a tumor and give medical suggestions based on such probabilities. And when we start a scientific career, here are the probabilities of different career pathways we may consider. Fortunately, our brain is prepared. A large body of research in the last 3 decades shows that people can make Bayesian-like inference in a variety of perceptual, motor, and cognitive tasks. Of course, the computation is all about probability distributions. However, we still do not know much about how people learn probability distributions, which itself is a very important inference problem. For example, during World War II, London was attacked by German flying bombs. How do we know what locations would be more likely to be hit by the bombs based on the limited samples we have? This problem could be difficult because it's an inductive problem, which means it can have infinite alternative solutions. Let me explain a little bit. What we observed from the world are samples. We like to infer the generated model behind. Even when considering a one-dimensional dataset like this, the generated model could vary in many different dimensions. So how could people solve this induction problem? In general, prior or inductive bias is needed for solving induction problems. The question I'm going to focus on is, what inductive biases or prior beliefs do people have when they learn an arbitrary probability distribution? For solving inductive problems in general, Ockham, Kant, Galileo, Newton, and Einstein, they all suggest Occam's razor, also known as the law of parsimony or the simplicity principle. That is, if multiple models fit the data equally well, choose the simplest one. As we know, the development of scientific theories follows Occam's razor. It's widely believed that human cognition also follows Occam's razor. For example, a large part of Gestalt perception may be explained by Occam's razor. But how about our particular problem, the learning of probability distributions? The evidence is mixed. One line of evidence supports Occam's razor, showing that Gaussian distributions, which can be described by only 2 free parameters, may be easier to learn than multimodal distributions. But there's also evidence against Occam's razor. For example, these 2 studies use computational modeling to infer the distributions represented in the human brain, and it seems people represent Gaussian distributions as distributions with multiple clusters. This may sound a little bit counterintuitive. Consider the London bomb example. Like many people, you probably see 2 clusters around the park and the river. However, statisticians find that the hit locations were just random. Seeing clusters is your illusion. Of our earlier work is consistent with such illusions, but the evidence is purely model-based. Because modeling human behavior is also an inductive problem. When we see multimodal representations for Gaussian distributions, we're not so certain whether it's an illusion of our participants or our modeling procedures. More recently, we have worked on developing new behavioral tasks and the data analysis methods to more directly reveal the possible biases. For example, using spectral analysis, we have detected multimodality in human reconstruction of probability distributions, even when the ground truth is a uniform distribution. And participants have observed thousands of samples from the distribution. What I'm going to talk today is some of our most recent unpublished work along this line. The first part is my PhD student, Teng Tianyuan's work, which includes convergent empirical results from two very different tasks. The second part is a theoretical work with Tianyuan and our collaborator, Dr. Li Wenliang from UCL. Let's start with our first task. Distribution recognition. On each trial, participants would see a sequence of samples, and then 4 distribution options. Their task was to judge which distribution was closest to the samples they saw. Here's a demo. Okay. The generated distribution in the experiment could be a Gaussian distribution or Gaussian mixtures with 2, 3, or 4 clusters. We constructed 6 sets of distributions. The 4 distributions in each set are matched in mean and variance. On each trial, 1 distribution from one set was chosen as a true distribution, where samples were drawn. The sample size could be 20, 60, 80, or 160. All 4 distributions from the set then served as the options. Before looking at the real data, let's first see how an ideal observer would behave. In the plot of model prediction, each row is for 1 true distribution, and each column is for 1 option. If the observer simply maximizes the likelihood samples are generated, most of the time, the observer would correctly choose Gaussian option for Gaussian distributions, 2-cluster Gaussian mixture for 2-cluster Gaussian mixture samples, 3 for 3, and 4 for 4. Instead, if the observer follows Alkan's razor and penalizes options with more clusters, we may expect a bias towards Gaussian. Here is the data. As you see, when the samples were from the Gaussian distribution, participants had a considerable probability to report 2 or 3 clusters. It could not just be noisy responses, because for samples from 2, 3, or 4 clusters, the probability of incorrectly choosing Gaussian was much lower. This can't be explained by an ideal observer maximizing likelihood, neither by Alkan's razor. This pattern can be better described by a model that assumes the prior of 2 or 3 clusters. A formal model comparison confirms this, and of course, this is just descriptive. A summary plot. Participant has a bias of choosing distributions with 2 or 3 clusters. In 2 additional experiments, including an online experiment, we future varied the visual form of the option distributions as the outcome of the samples to exclude potential low-level confounding factors. Again, we found no Alkan's razor. Participants prefer to choose distributions with 2 or 3 clusters. This would conclude our first task. The results are striking, but still have some weakness. If a participant sees a bimodal or trimodal distribution from Gaussian samples, it's not necessarily unique. We can't know whether it's the same bimodal or trimodal distributions in the option set. In other words, these false choices can tell us what does the represented structure exactly look like. This motivates our second task, the structure density estimation task, where participants saw a sequence of samples described as lava rocks from invisible volcanoes and were asked to report the location, the weight, and the width of each volcano. Here is a demo. A response, identifying the centers of volcanoes, and then the weight and the width of each. Okay. Just a sanity check. This plot shows that participants could track the mean, SDE, and skewness of the distribution reasonably well. These are some example trials. Each colored curve is a reported density from one trial. The black dashed curve below is a true density. Again, we can see biases for 2 to 3 clusters, even for the unimodal distribution. We have run 3 experiments. The first 2 experiments use visual stimuli as in the demo, and tested a variety of different unimodal and multimodal distributions. To include a probability that our findings are more modality specific, in experiment 3, we use numbers as stimuli. Meanwhile, to exclude a probability that participants' multimodal biases came from the multimodal distribution they saw in our experiments, we only use unimodal distributions in experiment 3. Let's first look at the number of clusters from participants' report. Here are histogram plots for experiment 1, separately for unimodal, bimodal, and trimodal distributions. We can see the relative frequency of reporting 2 or 3 clusters at highest, no matter what the true distribution is. It's similar results for experiment 2. In experiment 3 with numeric stimuli, participants still prefer multiple clusters, even though all the stimuli they saw are unimodal. But the number of clusters they prefer is larger than the usual visual modality, up to 5 clusters. We have used different sample sizes in these experiments. We find that when sample size increases, the reported cluster number does not come closer to the ground truth, but instead increases with sample size. We also find that the reported cluster number does not rely on the range of the stimuli. In the number experiment, 2 sets of stimuli were tested on 2 groups of participants. Numbers in the second set were 5 times as large as those in the first set, but the mean number of reported clusters stayed the same. Our structure density estimation task provides a very rich dataset, allowing us to assess information far beyond class number. For example, we quantified the percentage of overlap between adjacent clusters in participants' reports. The 3 panels from top to bottom illustrate what the report would look like if the overlap were 20%, 10%, or 5%. What we found in the data is that the overlap is low, about 5% or even lower. In other words, the representation is sparse in space. which confirms the modeling results of our previous study. This means participants are not just using multiple clusters to approximate a true distribution. Their representation could deviate strikingly from the ground truth, at least for Gaussian distributions. We may use stereotype matching modality to summarize our empirical findings. It can't be explained by Occam's razor, and it's also not because samples are too few. The reported cluster number even increases with sample size, instead of converging to the ground truth. What's the learning process behind such stereotype multimodality? Collaborating with Wen Liang, we have modeled the data of our structure density estimation task and show how the structure's representation arises from a sample-by-sample learning process. The basic idea is like this. Suppose an observer is trying to build an internal model out of samples in order to recover the latent clusters in the true distribution. Model here refers to the observer's structured representation. As soon as the true number of clusters is unknown, the observer would face the following problem. At time 1, there comes one sample. It formed a cluster by itself. A second sample comes. Now there are two possibilities, creating a new cluster for the new sample, or grouping it into the old cluster. Every time a new sample comes, the observer may choose the growth model by creating a new cluster or updating the existing clusters. So, how could one decide what to do with the specific sample? Let's zoom in and take a closer look. Suppose we start with an internal model with two clusters. In this structured representation, each cluster is described by three parameters, the mean, SD, and the sample number. When a new sample comes, it has some probability to join cluster 1. If so, the mean, SD, and the sample number of cluster 1 will be updated. Similarly, if it's assigned to cluster 2 will be updated. In the case a new cluster is created for the sample, a new set of cluster parameters is added to the representation. The probability that a new sample will belong to a specific cluster is determined by Bayesian inference. That is, the probability that this sample joins a specific existing or new cluster times the likelihood is generated by the given cluster. If we assume each cluster corresponds to a Gaussian component, it's obvious that the likelihood depends on how close the sample is to cluster center and how large the SD of the cluster is. But what prior should one use? The Richest process is a random process that allows infinite expansion of clusters. It has been used by Anderson and the following researchers as a prior over cluster assignment to model human categorization problems. It's basically the rich get richer. The probability for a new sample to join a specific existing cluster is proportional to a number of samples in the cluster, and the probability to create a new cluster is proportional to a constant alpha, the concentration parameter. It has recently been proved in statistics that Bayesian inference based on the Richest process may overestimate a number of latent clusters in the sample, and this overestimation may even increase with sample size. This can partly explain our findings if we assume that humans use a similar prior. However, as a prior used by human cognition, the Richest process can be unrealistic because the number of clusters can keep growing with sample size up to infinity, which can't be afforded by our capacity-limited memory system. What we have considered in our model here is a more economical model expansion by assuming that the concentration parameter alpha exponentially decays with the number of existing clusters. The total number of clusters is more likely to satisfy the memory limit. We will call the model with the original Richest process prior the basic model, and the other the equal model. Before showing our modeling results, I'd like to highlight the unusual high dimensionality of our behavioral reports. Compared to the usual NAFC reports. As we know, each cluster is coded in 3 dimensions. In a trial, if 3 clusters are reported, this would mean 9 dimensions. As participants could report as many or as few clusters as they wish, the number of data dimensions may vary from trial to trial. The sample-driven model expansion is also high-dimensional. We have developed computational methods to fit the high-dimensional models to each participant's high-dimensional behavioral reports using maximum likelihood estimates. Here is just a visualization of model prediction versus data for some example trials. And this is a comparison of the basic model and the equal model for individual participants. The equal model has an exceedant probability of about 99% to outperform the basic model. And the right plot shows the concentration parameter alpha, which controls the prior probability of creating a new cluster. And it does decay quickly with the number of existing clusters. The fitted model parameters can also help us understand participants' prior beliefs. One thing we find here is a narrow and strong prior for the SD of each cluster. As our simulation shows, such parameter values would lead to minimal overlap between clusters, just as observed in the human data. A quick summary of what we have found so far. In different tasks and modalities, we find convergent behavioral evidence for stereotype multimodal representations of probability distributions. And by modeling such high-dimensional behavioral data, we have identified a learning process with economically expanded internal models. And this is all. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, thanks, Professor Zhang Hang, for your nice talk. So let's see if we have some questions from audience. So in your modeling work, I guess I'm not sure if the computation cost is large. So because for human, if he observes sequential data, he may decide whether the sample is from an old cluster or it's a new cluster. So can you comment on this?
Yes, I totally agree. Actually, what assumed in previous literature and also what we implement here is an approximate algorithm to do set Bayesian inference. It's a particle filter. In particular, we implemented a single particle filter. It would be much easier to compute this instead of do the fully Bayesian inference. But it also has some, I should say, features instead of bugs. It's like it may predict a sequential effect. That is, the cluster, what you come out from the samples depend on the presentation sequence of these samples. This would not be a feature of the fully Bayesian inference, but this is a feature of human data.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So maybe another question. So you talk about the memory effect. So in your so how do you think that this memory can affect the cluster forming?
This is a good question. Actually, in our current modeling, we could not claim the cause and effects. We don't know whether it's because we have a very limited memory capacity, so we have so limited number of clusters. It's just kind of, we are trying to get information from the data, but it's possible to test this in future studies. Like if you ask subjects to do, say, a secondary task, whether we would see a smaller number of clusters formed in their representation.
Okay. So thanks. I think due to the time constraints, it's lunchtime. So I think we close our forum here. And we thank all the speakers this morning and thanks all the audience for participation. So see you next year.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.